Attacks Iran-backed facilities in Syria.
The U.S. military has conducted what they refer to as self-defense strikes on two facilities in eastern Syria that they say are used by Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and Iranian-backed proxy groups.
Plus, President Joe Biden is facing domestic pressures over foreign conflicts.
9 members of Congress, mostly from the progressive wing of Biden's Democratic Party, voted against a resolution backing Israel and condemning Hamas.
And later, what happens to Russian soldiers in Ukraine who don't follow orders? Plus, King Charles is headed to Kenya. Today is Friday, October 27th, and this is VOA's International Edition. From VOA headquarters in Washington, I'm Steve Karish. A developing story out of the Pentagon. Late Thursday night in Washington, the Secretary of Defense announced that the U.S. has attacked facilities in Syria used by Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and affiliated groups. For more, I'm joined by VOA's Pentagon correspondent, Carla Babb.
That's right. The U.S. military has conducted what they refer to as self-defense strikes on two facilities in eastern Syria that they say are used by Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and Iranian-backed proxy groups. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin says the precision strikes are a response to this series of strikes that have been going on against U.S. forces in Iraq and Syria over the past few days. Our latest tally that I have from multiple officials is that at least 17 attacks have occurred in Iraq and Syria over the last few days. Because of this, because of all of these injuries and this death, the secretary said that there is safety of U.S. personnel is a priority, and he said that the president directed these strikes that happened tonight because he said that he wanted to make clear that the United States will not tolerate such attacks and will defend itself, its personnel, and its interests.
And is the Pentagon saying that the previous strikes on American forces in the region originated from these facilities in Syria?
They have not gotten into that level of specificity at this point, but we do know that the Pentagon has reiterated several times, and the White House has reiterated several times, that these attacks over the last few days were conducted by Iranian-backed proxies that are funded by Iran, and ultimately they hold Iran accountable for these actions. But they said this is not in their minds, this is not intended to expand the war. It was narrowly tailored to defend U.S. personnel in Iraq and Syria, the Pentagon says, and it has nothing to do with the ongoing conflict between Israel and Hamas, with the defense secretary saying tonight that they do not want this to constitute a shift in the U.S. approach to the Israel-Hamas conflict. They urge all state and non-state actors in the region not to escalate this into a broader regional war.
Do we know what the United States used to make these attacks? Was it troops? Was it planes? How did it happen?
This was an aerial assault. I am unclear if it was manned or unmanned aircraft at this time, but it was definitely airstrikes that were conducted. And I have been told by officials that these strikes had been planned for several days, that they were waiting for the right timing, the right conditions to strike back against these proxy groups.
Carla Babb is VOA's Pentagon correspondent. Carla, thanks for your reporting on this breaking story.
You're welcome.
As we've seen with Carla, the military situation in the Middle East is growing more tense. The same is true with the political situation in Washington. Joe Biden campaigned on ending forever wars. He now faces the new conflict in Gaza amid the ongoing Ukraine war and rising Sino-U.S. tensions over Taiwan. How he handles these challenges amid domestic pressures, including dissent from progressives within his own party and a new Speaker of the House with a track record of opposing aid for Ukraine, may affect his re-election bid in 2024. VOA's White House Bureau Chief Patsy Widakuswara has the story.
Amid mounting Palestinian deaths from Israeli airstrikes that the Hamas-run health ministry in Gaza says have surpassed 7,000, This comment from U.S. President Joe Biden.
I have no notion that the Palestinians are telling the truth about how many people are killed. I'm sure innocents have been killed, and it's the price of waging a war.
The statement angered American Arabs, Muslims, and others already protesting Biden's handling of the war in Gaza.
This is shocking and dehumanizing. Would the president feel better if 1,000 Palestinian children had died?
Progressives are also angry. 9 members of Congress, mostly from the progressive wing of Biden's Democratic Party, voted against a resolution backing Israel and condemning Hamas because it did not mourn the loss of Palestinian lives or mention the two-state solution. Various polls show more Americans sympathize with Israelis than with the Palestinians, though younger Americans are more divided.
With American Jews, a very important group in terms of votes and also contributions to the Democratic Party, there's been almost universal praise for President Biden and the way he's handled this.
Republicans in Congress are increasingly skeptical of Biden's commitment to fund foreign wars, including newly elected House Speaker Mike Johnson, who is against sending more money to Ukraine without conditions, but is sympathetic to Israel.
The first bill that I'm going to bring to this floor in just a little while will be in support of our dear friend Israel, and we're overdue in getting that done.
The share of voters who approve of Biden's handling of the issue has increased by 9 percentage points since the days immediately following Hamas' attack on Israel. How the war in Gaza will impact Biden's re-election bid in 2024 will depend on whether the conflict can be contained. In neighboring Lebanon, cross-border attacks have intensified between Israel and Iran-backed Hezbollah.
If we get involved directly in these forever wars, yes, Biden will suffer. As long as he keeps American troops out of the line of fire, I don't think it will be nearly as controversial, and I don't think it will be a major factor in people's votes.
Sabato added another key factor, whether Palestinian deaths can be minimized and humanitarian aid delivered. Patsy Widakuswara, VOA News at the White House.
French President Emmanuel Macron is seeking to promote his proposal to defeat Hamas and other terrorist groups. His suggestion came as he completed a visit to Israel, the West Bank, Jordan, and Egypt. VOA's senior diplomatic correspondent Cindy Sain has the details.
During his visit to the Middle East this week, in the wake of the October 7th Hamas attacks that killed 1,400 Israelis, French President Emmanuel Macron made headlines by suggesting that the international coalition to defeat the Islamic State group widen its scope to also target Hamas.
On the basis of this experience, let us build with all the states which are ready to help. Today, Israel, but all the countries in the region, to fight against terrorist groups, including Hamas, to share information, to identify these terrorists and neutralize them.
Macron's office clarified that the proposal was not about sending troops on the ground, but that it rather would involve sharing intelligence and combating the financing of terrorism. The U.S. State Department designated Hamas a terrorist group in 1997. The European Union and other Western countries also consider Hamas to be a terrorist organization. But Hamas has received verbal support from Turkey and Arab countries such as Qatar and is backed by Iran. Bruce Hoffman, an expert in counterterrorism with the Council on Foreign Relations, said he doubts Macron's idea will win much support among Arab countries because of the outrage over Israel's retaliatory attacks on Gaza. He spoke to VOA via Zoom.
I think given how messy Gaza is now with the destruction that's been caused, with the displacement of populations, it would be very difficult for many countries to commit to any kind of active role in Gaza's future or in countering Hamas.
Catherine Zimmerman, a counterterrorism expert with the American Enterprise Institute, told VOA that finding any practical solution to stopping Hamas terror would be a huge challenge. She spoke to VOA via Zoom.
It's a very difficult needle to thread, and I actually think it might be impossible with Hamas itself, where the group's mission statement it's not to advance the Palestinian cause, but in there is the idea of destroying Israel. And so it would literally mean transforming what Hamas is in order to deal with this terrorism problem.
U.S. President Joe Biden has repeatedly called for another step that Macron has also backed, a revival of the two-state-based Israeli-Palestinian peace process once the Gaza war is over. Cindy Sain, VOA News.
And here are some more stories we're following from around the world. At least 18 people were killed Wednesday night in mass shootings at a restaurant and bowling alley in the northeastern U.S. state of Maine, sparking a massive search for the suspect, who is a trained firearms instructor. Meanwhile, authorities urged residents to lock themselves in their homes. Businesses and schools announced closures on Thursday. Media watchdogs and journalists in Zimbabwe are angry after members of the vice presidential security detail ordered journalists to delete photos and video of second vice president Kembo Mohadi collapsing at a campaign rally on Saturday. As Mohadi was airlifted to an unknown destination for medical attention, the security detail rounded up journalists and ordered them to wipe out recordings of the event. Malawi is seeing a spike in cholera cases, this just 2 months after the government lifted a public health emergency declaration that had been in place since early 2022. And in an emergency session of the Terrorist Financing Targeting Center this week, the U.S. called on allies in the Middle East to increase efforts to cut off outside funding for Hamas. Israel's military briefly entered northern Gaza late Wednesday night into Thursday morning. VOA's Rick Pantaleo spoke with correspondent Linda Gradstein in Jerusalem for an update.
The Israeli military says its troops and tanks briefly entered northern Gaza overnight into Thursday, hitting several militant targets as a wider ground incursion loomed after more than 2 weeks of war. What have you heard about this, Linda?
Well, this was a limited ground incursion of tanks, and it was the first ground incursion, but it's not what we've all been kind of waiting for. It was limited. It was just over the border, and then it came back. Israel said it was looking for Hamas infrastructure, and it apparently found some of the openings to the tunnels. Hamas has a whole network of tunnels running underneath northern Gaza. So it was looking for that, and Israeli officials said it was paving the way for the ground invasion, which is still to come.
Speaking of tunnels, I understand that security experts are saying that one of the biggest challenges facing Israel, should they implement a ground war in Gaza, is the Hamas tunnel network, hundreds of kilometers long and up to 80 meters deep, and it has been described by one freed hostage as a spider web. Can you tell us about the Hamas network of tunnels and what role they might be playing and what role they are playing in the conflict?
Yes, so these tunnels were obviously built over many years. Hamas apparently even has like special telephones where people in the tunnels can speak to each other without it being detected by cell phone networks or, Israeli spy equipment. And that's believed to be where most of the Hamas fighters in Gaza are holed up and kind of waiting for the Israeli ground troops to go in. And that could be one reason why Israel is waiting for a large-scale ground invasion, because it's going to be very difficult. Hamas is going to have the advantage once that ground invasion starts. And if, they're in all of these tunnels, they can just pop out at any point and attack the Israeli forces. I did see today that Israel has some new weapons that it's planning. One is called like the sponge, and it's something that can kind of seal off the tunnels. But it's going to be, assuming Israel goes ahead with this, which I'm still not completely convinced. I think it's possible that Israel will decide not on a full-scale ground invasion, but on sort of smaller pinpoint strikes like we saw overnight, as a way of trying to get rid of Hamas without endangering too many Israeli soldiers. But if it does go for a full ground invasion and getting rid of this tunnel network, you're talking about months of hand-to-hand combat in these tunnels.
Israel conducted a military drill close to its border with Lebanon on Thursday. Heavily armed Hezbollah, which is part of an Iranian-backed regional alliance. What about this drill close to the Lebanon border.
Right. Well, this drill was meant to send a message to Hezbollah that Israel is ready for anything. There have been almost daily kind of clashes across the border between Israel and Hezbollah. If you stand on the northern border with Israel, as I've done, you can actually see Hezbollah positions in plain view. I mean, you don't even need binoculars. But at least so, and Israel has clashed with Hezbollah. They've sent over anti-tank weapons. Israel's responded with artillery fire. And Israel says that at least 30 Hezbollah gunmen have been killed since the war began. At the same time, it doesn't seem that Hezbollah really wants a full-scale war with Israel. Hezbollah has at least 150,000 rockets that can reach any part of Israel. And it could be, very difficult for Israel to fight on two fronts, both on Gaza and on Lebanon. Israel says they're prepared to do so, but at least so far, Hezbollah has been sort of, I think, being very careful not to overstep something, for example, by sending a rocket that would kill a bunch of Israeli civilians. The targets that Hezbollah has been firing at have been military. It's been using smaller weapons. Again, that could change, but the sense right now is that Hezbollah does not want a war with Israel.
That's VOA's Rick Pantaleo speaking with Linda Gradstein in Jerusalem. From Washington, it's VOA's International Edition. I'm Steve Karish. The United States has information that the Russian military is executing its own soldiers who do not follow orders related to the war, the White House said on Thursday. John Kirby is White House National Security Council spokesperson.
We believe they have suffered thousands of casualties in their effort to conduct this offensive, some of them on the orders of their own leaders. We have information that the Russian military has been actually executing soldiers who refuse to follow orders. We also have information that Russian commanders are threatening to execute entire units if they seek to retreat from Ukrainian artillery fire.
An August report from the New York Times citing unnamed U.S. officials indicated that the number of Ukrainian and Russian troops killed or wounded since the war in Ukraine began in February of 2022 is nearing 500,000 people. Ahead of a scheduled visit to Kenya by Britain's King Charles III and Queen Camilla, the Talai clan of the Kipsigis community is petitioning the king to help them receive compensation for the loss of land during the colonial period. The request comes amid UN criticism of the British government's unresolved colonial-era land disputes. Francis Antanwa reports.
The picturesque highlands of Kericho County in Kenya's Rift Valley. But beneath the scenic rolling hills and sprawling tea estates are dark secrets deeply buried in the very soul of this community. When the British arrived in this part of the world, the Kipsigis community and the people of its Talai clan were evicted from their lands under the Crown Lands Ordinance of 1902, which essentially transferred ownership of their lands to the British.
Before the white man came, we were staying well with no problems with other people. Where my mother came from, we were all friends.
Kibore Cheruyot Ngasura is among the few surviving Talai elders who took part in the colonial resistance of the 1940s, which led to his detention by British colonizers. Today he is 106 years old and lives on the fringes of what was once his ancestral heaven, on a piece of land he bought after he was freed. He will live to see Britain's new King Charles III make a state visit to Kenya from October the 31st to November the 3rd, Charles' first to a Commonwealth nation since succeeding his mother, Queen Elizabeth II, last year.
We welcome the king. He is welcome here, but he must remember the Talai people. We have gone through a hard time, and he should do something about it.
Chito Arap Mitei is a former colonial-era prison warden.
We want back our property. We want back our property.
Kenya declared its independence from Britain in December of 1963. As Kenya gets ready to commemorate 60 years of independence, these peasant farmers have little cause for celebration, says Joel Kimeto, a leader and a scholar of the Kipsigis.
They should compensate us, and at the same time, they should now acknowledge and tell the Kenya government to revert back our Kipsigis ancestral lands, free of charge. We are not buying. When they came here, they did not buy.
In May 2021, United Nations Special Rapporteurs wrote to the UK government expressing concern about its failure to issue a public apology and provide reparations for the estimated 500,000 Kipsigis and Talai people who suffered under the British rule. The UK government said it issued an apology in 2013 and compensated Kenyans who lived through the emergency period and the Mau Mau insurgency and made claims. The Kipsigis and Talai note their complaint and case is separate. David Ngasura Tuwei is an advocate for the Kipsigis and the author of a book about them.
The objective of writing the books is to highlight the whole world. I want the whole world to know the plight of the Talai plus the Kipsigis, what the colonialists did to the Talai and Kipsigis people.
With Buckingham Palace saying in a statement that the king will acknowledge the more painful aspects of Britain and Kenya's shared history during his trip, there is hope that the visit could offer some semblance of historical closure. Francis Ontomwa, VOA News, Kericho, Kenya.
And that's going to wrap it up for us today. This has been International Edition on the Voice of America. On behalf of everyone at VOA, thanks for joining us. For pictures, stories, videos, and more, follow VOA News on your favorite social media platform and online at voanews.com. Until next time, I'm Steve Karish in Washington. Stay safe and have a great day.
Next, an editorial reflecting the views of the United States government.
The United States believes the United Nations has a crucial role to play in addressing the crisis in the Middle East, precipitated by Hamas's appalling terrorist attack against Israel on October 7th. The United States has put forward a resolution that sets out practical steps that we can take together toward that end, said Secretary of State Antony Blinken.
First, we all recognize the right and indeed the imperative of states to defend themselves against terrorism. That's why we must unequivocally condemn Hamas's barbaric terrorist attack against Israel. Babies riddled with bullets, young people hunted down and gunned down with glee, young people beheaded, families burned alive in a final embrace, parents executed in front of their children, children executed in front of their parents, and so many taken hostage in Gaza.
Second, we all agree on the vital need to protect civilians, stated Secretary Blinken.
We know Hamas does not represent the Palestinian people, and Palestinian civilians are not to blame for the carnage committed by Hamas. Palestinian civilians must be protected. That means Hamas must cease using them as human shields. It's hard to think of an act of greater cynicism. It means Israel must take all possible precautions to avoid harm to civilians. It means food, water, medicine, and other essential humanitarian assistance must be able to flow into Gaza and to the people who need them.
It is also critical that this conflict not widen, said Secretary Blinken.
To that end, we call on all member states to send a firm, united message to any state or non-state actor that is considering opening another front in this conflict against Israel, or who may target Israel's partners, including the United States. Don't throw fuel on the fire.
The United States does not seek conflict with Iran, said Secretary Blinken. But if Iran or its proxies attack U.S. personnel anywhere, make no mistake, we will defend our people. We will defend our security swiftly and decisively. And finally, we all agree that we must redouble our collective efforts to build an enduring political solution to the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, said Secretary Blinken. The United States stands ready to work with anyone who's ready to forge a more peaceful and secure future for the region.
That was an editorial reflecting the views of the United States government.
Gaza.
What we are providing to Israel is subject to the laws of war and to the requirements that steps be taken to protect innocent life.
Plus, Egypt's president warns against allowing the conflict to spill over its border.
Sisi also warned that any further expansion of the conflict is not in the interest of the region. He underscored it is like a time bomb that could destroy all.
And later, western Mexico is reeling from Hurricane Otis, and Spider-Man, or Spider-Men, and lots of them, in Buenos Aires. Today is Monday, October 30th, and this is VOA's International Edition. From VOA headquarters in Washington, I'm Steve Karish. We'll take a look in a little bit how the turmoil in the Middle East is affecting America's relationship with China. But now, the latest on the conflict. Israel is expanding air and ground operations on Gaza, striking dozens of underground tunnels, bunkers, and telecommunications equipment. To Israel's north, Lebanon's Hezbollah said on Sunday that it shot down an Israeli drone over southern Lebanon with a surface-to-air missile. It's the first time Hezbollah has demonstrated such a capability. Israel's military, which claimed more strikes on Sunday on what it describes as Hezbollah targets, did not comment. Also, fearing a growing regional conflict, Israel's neighbor to the east and staunch U.S. ally Jordan has asked the U.S. to deploy Patriot air defense missiles there. Meanwhile, as Israel intensifies its strikes against Hamas in Gaza, on Sunday, the Israel Defense Force reiterated its warning for civilians there to evacuate to the south, saying the need is now urgent. The United Nations warned on Sunday that civil order is starting to collapse in Gaza, this after thousands of people ransacked its food warehouses there, taking wheat, flour, and other supplies. As the death toll rises in Gaza, the Biden administration warned Israel on Sunday that it must protect civilian lives. All this as a military expert warned that Tel Aviv's mission to destroy Hamas could prove almost impossible. VOA's Veronica Balderas Iglesias has the details.
Israel Defense Forces underscored Sunday that the militant group Hamas, and not the people of Gaza, is the target of their military operations, which have now been expanded. But as more reports and footage emerge showing extensive damage in civilian areas, Israel's approach and the support the United States is giving it continues to receive scrutiny. Appearing on ABC's This Week, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan reaffirmed the U.S. position on the matter.
What we are providing to Israel is subject to the laws of war and to the requirements that steps be taken to protect innocent life. Those are requirements we impose any time we transfer weapons to another country.
Some relatives of the hostages taken by Hamas during its October 7th terror attack on Israel have expressed worries that the ground offensive could put those kidnapped at risk. But Sullivan added that there are several ongoing efforts to get them home safely.
We are prepared to support humanitarian pauses so that hostages can get out safely, and we will keep working at that every day.
The war to destroy Hamas was deemed a, quote, nearly impossible mission that could take months, according to retired Army General Robert Abrams, who also granted an interview to ABC.
The defense that Hamas will put up in that very dense urban terrain, unlike anything that we've seen in recent years, is going to require some very fierce fighting, and simultaneously trying to ensure that the Israelis do not target unwittingly the locations of the hostages.
General Abrams also elaborated on the matters that would need to be addressed after the military conflict comes to an end.
Hamas was created as a result of a lack of a separate Palestinian state, a two-state solution, as many people have talked about. That has to be somewhere, when you ask, how does this end? That has to be part of the equation.
In the meantime, the United Nations Agency for Palestinian Refugees voiced worry Sunday that people storming its Gaza aid warehouses is a sign that civil order is starting to break down. The warning came as Pope Francis renewed calls for a ceasefire in Gaza and the release of the hostages, many of whom are believed to have dual nationalities. Verónica Valderas Iglesias, VOA News, Washington.
Meanwhile, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said on Saturday Israel will destroy the enemy above ground and below ground as the war entered what he's calling its second phase. Reuters' Angela Johnston has more.
Israel is now in its second phase of the Gaza war, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said on Saturday, adding that forces are carrying out ground operations against Hamas militants. The war inside the Gaza Strip will be difficult and long, and we are prepared for it, he said. Netanyahu once again called on Palestinian civilians to leave the northern Gaza Strip, the focus of Israel's attack. Israel has tightened its blockade on Gaza and bombarded it for 3 weeks now. People are isolated, with a telephone and internet blackout that began on Friday. Many buildings there have been reduced to rubble. People are scrambling for food, water, fuel, and medicine. Gaza health authorities say over 7,500 Palestinians have been killed in the campaign. On October 7th, an assault by Hamas killed 1,400 Israelis in the deadliest day of the nation's 75-year history. Meanwhile, there has been growing concern internationally over the toll from the bombing in Gaza and calls for a pause to let aid get to civilians. Here's UN Human Rights Chief Volker Turk.
I am raising alarm about the possibly catastrophic consequences of large-scale ground operations in Gaza and the potential for thousands more civilians to die. Continued violence is not the answer.
Also on Saturday, Netanyahu met with families of Israelis being held hostage in Gaza by Hamas, vowing to exhaust every possibility to bring the more than 200 of them home.
That's Reuters' Angela Johnston reporting for us. A top Hamas official on Sunday called on Egypt to take decisive action to speed up aid to Gaza amid criticism over the pace of vital supplies reaching the war-torn Palestinian territory. Egypt should not remain a spectator, Hamas Politburo member Musa Abu Marzouk said. We expect a decisive stance by Egypt, allowing aid to enter Gaza as soon as possible. Gaza is suffering critical shortages of food, water, medicine, and fuel that aid agencies have warned could cause deaths. Dire though the situation may be, Egypt's President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi seems reluctant to get more involved and is warning against the conflict in Gaza growing beyond its borders, calling the entire region a ticking time bomb. Edward Uranian reports from Cairo.
Lebanon's Hezbollah militant group fired a surface-to-air missile at an Israeli drone along the Israeli-Lebanese border Saturday amid sporadic missile and rocket exchanges that have left many Lebanese worried that a war could erupt between Israel and Lebanon. After several apparent drone and rocket attacks along Egypt's northern border Friday, which left a number of people wounded, Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi warned Saturday against expanding the nearly 3-week-old Gaza conflict to other parts of the region, including Egypt. He says that drones entered Egyptian territory from Yemen Friday and were shot down. Sisi also warned that any further expansion of the conflict is not in the interest of the region. He underscored it is like a time bomb that could destroy all. He noted Egypt as a sovereign nation and asked everyone to respect its sovereignty and position on the map. Yemen's Houthi militia group, which controls much of northern Yemen and a coastline along the Red Sea, is an ally of both Iran and Lebanon's Hezbollah. It has used Iranian-supplied drones to attack other cities inside neighboring Saudi Arabia in the past. This is the first report of Houthi drones attacking Egypt. As Israeli attacks intensify against the pro-Iranian Hamas militia that controls Gaza, Iranian Foreign Minister Hussein Amir Abdullahian warned Saturday that groups which are Iran's allies are prepared to act if the war in Gaza continues. He added that Iran's allies have enough rockets, missiles, and drones that they can access as the need arises. Amir Abdullahian threatened Israel, saying the continued killing of women and children and civilians in Gaza and the West Bank will open the door to what he called a variety of options, and that anything is possible. He noted Iran's allies are trained and ready to move forward if need be. Amir Abdullahian also called for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza and noted that UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres is traveling to the region in the coming hours to try and find a political solution. Khatar Abu Diab, who teaches political science at the University of Paris, tells VOA that Egypt and other regional countries are increasingly concerned about their own national security, given both internal and external threats like Friday's attacks on the northern Sinai. Abu Diab says the attacks on Egypt may have been from Yemen or from the other side of the Egyptian border, but they are a threat to the country's security, and Egypt, like other regional states, is worried this conflict could spill over onto their own soil and threaten both their borders and their internal stability. Abu Diab points out that Egypt controlled the Gaza Strip from 1948 to 1967 and has had to deal with Islamic extremism from both Gaza and the northern Sinai for a long time. Egypt, he says, is prepared to stop any transfer of Palestinians to the Sinai to protect its own security. Saudi-owned Al Arabiya TV reported Saturday that a third convoy of aid trucks was prepared to enter Gaza to help the civilian population. It was not clear what supplies the convoy was carrying. President Sisi said Saturday that Egypt was working to facilitate the movement of the convoy into Gaza. Edward Uranian for VOA News, Cairo.
And here are other stories we're following from around the world. Authorities in Bangladesh detained a key opposition figure from the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, which called for a nationwide strike on Sunday, following a day of violent clashes with security forces. Media reports said at least 3 civilians died in the violence, which included an arson attack in the nation's capital, Dhaka. At least 1 police officer was killed and scores injured on Saturday when a massive rally by tens of thousands of opposition activists turned violent. The opposition is demanding the resignation of the prime minister. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz met with Nigerian President Bola Tinubu on Sunday as part of a West Africa tour as the European country looks to diversify its trade partners and expand economic partnerships in the energy-rich region. And the United Auto Workers Union has widened its strike against General Motors. It's the lone holdout among the 3 Detroit automakers after having reached a tentative agreement with the Jeep maker Stellantis. The escalated walkout began Saturday evening in Tennessee at GM's largest plant in North America, just hours after the Stellantis deal was reached. Tennessee's nearly 4,000 workers join about 14,000 already striking at GM factories in Texas, Michigan, and Missouri. We heard earlier how the United Nations warned that civil order was deteriorating in Gaza as people ransacked UN warehouses for food and supplies. Something similar is happening in Mexico, showing that desperation can force people to do things they might not ordinarily do. In the resort town of Acapulco, there's been a scramble for basic supplies in the days since Hurricane Otis slammed ashore. The strength of the storm caught forecasters by surprise, and area residents now seek food, fuel, and water to survive. VOA's Arash Arabasadi has more.
Police arrive at a gas station in Acapulco, Mexico at the scene of reported looting. Residents of this resort town screaming back at police as one man chants, "We are not stealing. We want gas. You are the robbers." The lack of basic needs follows the landfall of Hurricane Otis last week. In just 12 hours' time, Otis more than doubled strength from 113 to 257 kilometers per hour. Otis ultimately peaked at the strongest hurricane classification as a Category 5 storm, a hurricane with intensity that caught forecasters by surprise. National Hurricane Center Director Michael Brennan says that was because the storm found a much more favorable environment than anticipated, in part due to warmer waters, a result of climate change, and winds moving at just the right altitude and direction. The storm's damage created a desperate situation for many living in Acapulco. Scenes of widespread looting, from bare essentials like food and diapers to higher-end items like flat-screen TVs. Addressing reporters on Friday, Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador said nature, the creator, protected Mexico despite the hurricane's fury, adding fatalities appeared to be not so many. As of Sunday morning, the death toll is 39. For its part, the Mexican government responded by deploying the military to serve meals while medical personnel deliver care from makeshift clinics. Forecasters say the East Pacific lacks much of the hurricane-predicting infrastructure seen around the Atlantic coast of the United States. They say without buoys, robust land observation, and radars along the coast, they rely almost exclusively on satellite imagery, saying that leaves them with a jigsaw puzzle and only 10% of the pieces. For those living in a hurricane's path, that means little warning of what's to come. Arash Arabasadi, VOA News.
From Washington, it's VOA's International Edition. I'm Steve Karish. 1,000 Spider-Men in Argentina. That story coming up in a moment. But first, turmoil in the Middle East is only adding stress to the U.S.-China relationship. In fact, the U.S. and China stopped just short of announcing the anticipated meeting between U.S. President Joe Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping in November on the margins of the Asia-Pacific Cooperation Summit in San Francisco. This, according to two senior U.S. officials. The word came after Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi this week held talks with senior U.S. officials in Washington aimed at stabilizing bilateral ties. VOA State Department Bureau Chief Nike Ching has more.
U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken held talks with Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi in Washington, the first such face-to-face dialogue in recent years. On Friday, U.S. President Joe Biden met with Wang to underscore the need to manage U.S.-China competition responsibly. Officials from the two countries discussed a range of issues, including Israel's war with Hamas, Russia's war on Ukraine, the fentanyl crisis, and the South China Sea. Washington has called on China to use its influence over Iran to prevent a Middle East escalation. Matthew Miller is State Department spokesperson.
We know China has relationships with a number of countries in the region, and we would urge them to use those relationships, the lines of communications they have, to urge calm and stability. We don't think that increased stability benefits the United States. It doesn't benefit China. It certainly doesn't benefit the people of the region.
For his part, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang said China is willing to cooperate with the United States to manage differences.
China and the United States need to have dialogue. Not only should we resume dialogue, the dialogue should be in-depth and comprehensive, so that with dialogue we can increase mutual understanding, reduce misunderstanding and misjudgment.
推动双边关系止跌企稳，尽快回到健康、稳定、可持续的发展轨道。
But some U.S. lawmakers question China's continuing alignment with Russia and Iran. Congressman Mike Gallagher is a Wisconsin Republican who chairs the House Select Committee on Strategic Competition between the U.S. and the Chinese Communist Party.
It should be a wake-up call to the West. Increasingly, it looks like we have an axis of authoritarian powers that are arrayed against our interests and those of our allies. China is the dominant player in this partnership. Vladimir Putin is a junior partner, but increasingly there's collaboration with Iran.
During the talks with Wang, Biden and Blinken also expressed condolences on the passing of China's former Premier Li Keqiang, who died earlier on Friday. Nike Chin, VOA News, Washington.
And finally today, just in time for Halloween, some 1,000 people gathered in Buenos Aires on Sunday dressed as Spider-Man, aiming to break a world record for the most people dressed as the famous superhero in a single public event. Argentine influencer Uki Dean organized the gathering via Instagram, aiming to outdo an event in June in Malaysia where 685 people showed up dressed as Spider-Man. Dean said he was confident of obtaining the Guinness World Record title with turnout in Buenos Aires at the famous Obelisk Monument, where the crowd was a sea of skin-tight blue costumes and red masks. The organizers had participants provide signatures and have their photo taken as documentation to provide for the record-keeping group. And that's going to wrap it up for us today. This has been International Edition on the Voice of America. On behalf of everyone at VOA, thanks for joining us. For pictures, stories, videos, and more, follow VOA News on your favorite social media platform and online at voanews.com. Until next time, I'm Steve Karish in Washington. Stay safe and have a great day.
Next, an editorial reflecting the views of the United States government.
Trilateral relations among Japan, the Republic of Korea, the ROK, and the United States have been strengthening, as was evidenced by this summer's Trilateral Summit at Camp David. One area where the three nations share a long-time understanding and are fully aligned is the threat posed by the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, the DPRK, particularly its illicit nuclear and ballistic missile programs. But another threat has emerged in recent months, the DPRK's provision of arms to Russia that are used in Putin's brutal and all-out invasion of Ukraine. On October 25th, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, Japanese Foreign Minister Kamikaze Yoko, and ROK Foreign Minister Park Jin issued a joint statement in which they strongly condemned the provision of military equipment and munitions by the Democratic People's Republic of Korea to the Russian Federation for use against the government and people of Ukraine. Such weapons deliveries, several of which we now confirm have been completed, will significantly increase the human toll of Russia's war of aggression. The ministers noted that in return for supporting Russia, the DPRK is seeking military assistance to advance its own military objectives. They pointed out that arms transfers to or from the DPRK, as well as the transfer of dual-use technologies that could be used in the DPRK's WMD, ballistic missile, or conventional weapons programs, violate multiple UN Security Council resolutions. Russia itself, they observed, voted for the UN Security Council resolutions that contain these restrictions. Russia and the DPRK have made no secret of their burgeoning relationship. In September, Kim Jong-un traveled to Russia where the two leaders discussed military matters and toasted their friendship. In mid-October, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov met with Kim in Pyongyang. In their joint statement, the U.S., Japan, and the ROK expressed deep concern about the possibility of Russia's transferring any nuclear or ballistic missile technology to the DPRK. Such transfers, the ministers said, jeopardize the ongoing efforts of the international community to keep sensitive technologies out of the hands of actors who are working to destabilize regional security, threaten peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula, as well as across the globe. The United States, Japan, and the ROK stand together, they declared, resolute in our opposition to arms transfers and related military cooperation between the DPRK and Russia, and the deleterious effect such actions have on global security and non-proliferation.
Malta to look for solutions to end Russia's war on Ukraine.
Now, obviously, Russia wasn't at this meeting, so there was no expectation of a peace breakthrough there. But this is part of Ukraine's diplomatic offensive to isolate Russia.
Plus, what Ukraine's ambassador to the U.S. says will happen without continued aid from the United States.
I can tell you that Ukrainians will keep fighting. And whether it will mean that we will all die fighting or we will fight successfully, we frankly don't know. But what we know is that we don't have another home.
And later in the program, Ukrainian students at a university in the U.S. are raising money for their country's armed forces. Today is Monday, October 30th. From the Voice of America, this is Flashpoint Ukraine. Good evening, I'm Lori London in Washington. A third round of Ukrainian-backed peace talks opened in Malta on Saturday with representatives from more than 60 countries, but without Moscow, which condemned it as a blatantly anti-Russian event. I got details from correspondent Dorian Jones in Istanbul.
Well, I mean, to be fair to say, there wasn't any major breakthrough, but it has to be said the organizers weren't expecting this. They very much stress that this is part of an ongoing process. The previous ones were in Jeddah and Copenhagen, and the organizers, and particularly Ukraine, were very happy the fact that we see more attending. 20 more countries were represented either by online or physical representation, and they say that this is all part of a process where they aim to achieve some sort of global summit of leaders which will come together and back Ukraine's 10-point peace plan, which effectively means the withdrawal of all Russian forces and the prosecution of Russia for war crimes. Now, obviously, Russia wasn't at this meeting, so there was no expectation of a peace breakthrough there. But this is part of Ukraine's diplomatic offensive to isolate Russia. And they are particularly targeting what they call the southern world. And that is particularly countries in Africa and South America. Now, many of these countries have been neutral on the sidelines of this conflict. And Ukraine and its Western allies are seeking to bring them, as it were, into the fold against Russia. Meanwhile, Russia is still very much courting these countries as well. So this is part of this ongoing diplomatic offensive of isolating Russia and putting more economic and diplomatic pressure on Moscow to effectively capitulate.
And Russia itself is trying to influence a lot of these other countries and gain its own sort of alliance with, as we've heard recently, many countries and leaders, particularly Iran, North Korea, parts of Africa. How does that factor in?
Absolutely. I mean, this really is, it's not only a war actually on the ground in Ukraine, but there's also a very intense diplomatic war as both sides are trying to basically secure allies and maintain those allies. And you're right, Putin has been very much courting particularly Africa. He had a summit earlier this year in Moscow. He brought African leaders to Russia, and this is seen as very important in circumventing sanctions, but also in keeping Russia from being fully diplomatically isolated in the world. And that's, I think, also an important part of Moscow's game plan of this war of attrition against Ukraine. And also their similar efforts are going on in targeting countries, particularly like Brazil, major powerhouses, and keeping them at least not from joining the Western alliance and remaining neutral. So yes, you're right. This is this ongoing war throughout the world among international diplomacy between Moscow and Kiev.
Russia just recently said it's ready for talks on post-conflict settlement. But, as we know, territorial integrity is something that's going to be probably a really difficult challenge since Russia thinks it has a right to maintain occupation in parts of Ukraine, and Ukraine wants its country back entirely, as you said.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think, to be honest, that there's a lot of skepticism when Russia even talks about any kinds of peace or negotiations, be it post-war or not. And I think that there is seen as part of this Moscow diplomatic offensive. It wants to appear that it's not intransigent. Yes, it's ready to discuss the outcome and post-war discussions. And particularly Moscow stresses that it's not going to consider withdrawing from Ukraine. And for Ukraine, that's the bottom line. It wants Russia out of its territory, not only the territory it seized in this latest conflict, but also the Crimea as well. So there is absolutely no middle ground between these two sides as yet. And I think for the moment, both sides believe that they can determine the outcome on the ground in military warfare. And until both sides realize that they can't achieve those goals, there won't be any negotiations in the near future. That is the grim reality of the moment.
Do these leaders plan on meeting again, even though it just doesn't seem like there's any solid way forward?
It is seen as an ongoing process where I think Ukraine and its backers will just try to pick off more and more countries that are in Russia's orbit and drag them towards theirs, using this meetings as a vehicle for that process. And the ultimate goal will be at some point this year or early next year that they plan a global leaders summit where they really, I think, plan to ramp up the pressure on Russia. But to be honest, I think it does appear that for now at least, what happens in Ukraine on the battlefield is still the most important part of this conflict.
Dorian Jones reporting for VOA from Istanbul. Ukraine's ambassador to the United States, Oksana Markarova, was the featured speaker on Friday at the Military and Editors Association conference in Washington. The event was moderated by VOA Pentagon correspondent Carla Babb, who joined me to discuss the highlights of what was a very fruitful conversation.
She had a lot of really important things to say. You did ask specifically how concerned she was about continued support for Ukraine, given the current attitudes of some members in Congress right now.
That's right. So we here in the United States, we just have a new Speaker of the House, and Speaker Johnson, who was elected last week, while he has said that he is looking forward to finding ways to get aid for both Israeli partners and Ukrainian partners. While he says that, and while he has also said that Putin should not be allowed to win and that the U.S. needs to stop Putin from winning, he has also repeatedly voted against Ukrainian aid. He has raised concerns about auditing and finding where this aid is going. And so I asked her if she was concerned about the situation in Washington, D.C. right now and the growing war in the Middle East. And she said that, she pointed to his comments about Putin and says, that's a good sign. Ukrainians need a partner that also understands that Putin cannot be allowed to come in and take territory from a sovereign nation. And she went into the audit portion of that because she is formally in finance before she became the Ukrainian ambassador to the United States. And she says that there is public transparency and there are audits going on with Ukrainians in every single portion of the aid that they have been given. And she listed the different types of aid that had been given. And she said, as long as it hadn't been classified as secret, we have been able to publicly display all of our aid given. And she goes, and that's why it's so important that the Ukrainians keep getting aid, because you can see through our audits that we the Ukrainians need more weapons, she says. And she goes, the biggest concern that she sees at the moment is delays, because if the aid is delayed, then that gives Russians time to fortify their defenses on the battlefield, and that puts Ukrainians at an even bigger disadvantage. She says they have to fight everywhere. Right now, there are more than 400,000 Russian fighters on Ukrainian territory, and she said that one of the biggest back and forths that is talked about with analysts and experts in war is that Ukraine is not focused on one or two areas. They're trying to defend everywhere. She says that has to happen because they've seen what Russia is capable of doing in places like Bucha, where the massacre happened of civilians. And she says that the Ukrainians feel that it is their duty to protect citizens everywhere, and no place needs to be safe for Russians to kill and rape and send people off to Russian territory and kidnap them. She says that can't happen. And so they're doing what they say is the best that they can do to keep fighting against Russian aggression.
And let's listen to a bit of what she said about her concerns about losing support.
We are concerned that delays in this might just cause, the more deaths and more horrible situations on the ground, because we also have to be very clear. The choice we're making now is not between Ukraine getting more support and winning and not getting more support and staying where we are. No, because Russia didn't change the intent. So if we will not get the support, it's just a matter of time when Russia will start winning.
Do you feel like you have enough aid coming in now to win the war?
Well, not to win the war. To win the war, we need another additional support from both the U.S. and European Union and other countries. Right now, we have used all the budget support that we have received from the U.S., so we don't have any incoming budget support available. On the energy and humanitarian side, we still have some money available from the previous budget. And on the military support, the only amount available is the presidential drawdown. So we cannot order anything. The USAI is used. I think all of it except for like 300 million, if I'm not mistaken, or even less. And there is nothing else left. So it's only the Presidential Drawdown Authority, which the package was announced yesterday, 150 million, but it's a very small package. We need to order more from American companies, especially in air defense, especially in radars, especially in the artillery, which, as you know, is a very scarce resource, the interceptors for the air defense. So for all of that, we need new supplementary money.
And you also talked to her a bit about whether or not there's also added concern now because of what's happening in the Middle East and if supporting Israel will take away some of the focus on Ukraine.
That's right. So there is a concern here in the United States about supporting two different wars and two allies. President Biden has said repeatedly that the U.S. can walk and chew gum at the same time, is how they refer to that, meaning that they are perfectly capable of supplying Ukraine and Israel with weapons and support. She said that when I asked her, is she worried that the focus will be taken away from Ukraine with this war in the Middle East now? She said, we have to keep our focus on both. She said that these Hamas, Iran, Russia, they are the same axis of evil, she said. And she pointed to how Russia is using Iranian Shahed drones in Ukraine right now, thousands of them. And she pointed to how Hamas is using weapons and rockets that were given to Hamas by Iran, bought with Iranian money.
When, unfortunately, we see the frequent visits of Hamas and Iran to Moscow and how they are coordinating and discussing their actions, and I think all of us, without even being present at those meetings, can guess that they're not discussing how to return peace to the world on those meetings.
And so she says that the focus has to remain everywhere in Ukraine and the Middle East in order for the West and democracy and institutions that stand up against the murdering of innocent civilians can win.
And Carla, one of the reporters attending asked her directly what will happen if Ukraine no longer receives support from the United States.
That's right. And she said that the Ukrainians don't have a choice. This is an existential fight for them. She says that Russia has made it clear that Russia wants to destroy Ukraine. And if Ukrainians refuse to bow down to Russians, then they will kill them all. So they feel that it is a threat that they have to meet no matter what. So she says that it's crucial that the United States and Western allies fund them, but they really do not have a choice in this matter.
Well, it's going to be extremely difficult for us. It's very difficult to guess what will happen, but I can tell you that Ukrainians will keep fighting. And whether it will mean that we will all die fighting or we will fight successfully, we frankly don't know. But what we know is that we don't have another home and we don't have another land. And we will fight for this one as long as we will be able to do so. And frankly, that's what Ukrainians did even after the World War II ended, fighting, the Ukrainian freedom fighters were fighting against the Soviets all the way until 1954. Now, the implications of that is going to be much wider than just for Ukraine. If Russia can win after they have violated the UN Charter, after they have violated all the rules which both of our countries believe should be in place, if the authoritarian nuclear state led by a war criminal, indicted war criminal by the International Court, can actually win over Ukraine and move forward, then I think the question is not only what Ukrainians would do, but what will all of us do? We just have to be very clear that, yes, it's going to be very difficult. We are, in military sense, 100% dependent on our partners now.
And she stressed multiple times, as I mentioned, that they need more weapons. Look at what's happening here in the United States at the moment. Ukrainian pilots last week just started training on F-16s. Those are fighter jets in Arizona. That is the last major piece of weaponry that Ukrainians have asked for and have yet to receive. They have received long-range ATACMS. Those are the missiles that are fired out of ground defenses of HIMARS further into Russian control Russian-controlled territory. They have those now. They have M1A1 Abrams tanks. They have not yet used them on the battlefield. At least they have not publicly disclosed that they have used them on the battlefield. But those arrived last month to be at the use and at the ready for Ukrainian forces when they can find the appropriate place to put them in the battlefield. And now they are looking, starting next spring, to getting F-16s. So they're slowly getting all the weaponry they need. But just having this weaponry is not enough. You're going to need more of it to replace the stuff that Russia takes out. And most importantly, you're going to need the munitions that go with them. So for every ATACMS that's launched, it needs to be replaced. And that takes time, that takes money. And that is why she says it is critical for the United States and its allies to stay with Ukraine. And she pointed out to a lot of people in the United States who are concerned that funding the wars in Ukraine or the war in Israel is depleting U.S. stocks. She tried to look at it in another way. She goes, for every piece of equipment that is sent to Ukraine, money is flowing into U.S. commercial companies that are making new equipment. And the Pentagon is able to dip into that money and get brand new equipment for its fighters. So she's trying to say that this is not just a benefit for Ukraine, it's a benefit for commercial companies in the United States. It's a benefit for the Pentagon, and overall, it's a benefit for democracy if Russia can be defeated.
VOA Pentagon correspondent Carla Babb, thank you so much for being with us. Russia and Ukraine pressed on with their military operations on Sunday, striking each other's military targets, including drones, command posts, and electronic warfare systems. That, according to their latest updates. We hear more now from Associated Press correspondent Mimi Montgomery.
Russia's defense ministry says its air defenses shot down 36 Ukrainian drones over the Black Sea and the Crimean Peninsula. Authorities in a southern region bordering the Black Sea confirms an oil refinery caught fire there, and local media reports it may have been the result of a Ukrainian strike or a downed drone. In Ukraine, the country's air force confirms the shooting down of 5 Iranian-made drones launched by Russia. Drone strikes and shelling on the Russian border regions and the Crimean Peninsula happen regularly. I'm Mimi Montgomery.
You're listening to VOA's Flashpoint Ukraine. I'm Lori London. Hundreds of anti-Israel protesters on Sunday stormed Russia's Dagestan airport, where a plane from Israel had just arrived, forcing Russian security forces to close the airport and divert flights while removing the demonstrators. We hear more from Associated Press correspondent Charles de Ledesma.
Video shows a large, angry crowd of people moving through the main airport in the Dagestan region, then rushing onto the landing field, chanting anti-Semitic slogans and seeking passengers arriving on a flight from the Israeli city of Tel Aviv. Further video on social media shows some in the crowd waving Palestinian flags and others trying to overturn a police car. Dagestan's Ministry of Health says more than 20 people were injured, with 2 in critical condition, the injured including police officers and civilians. I'm Charles de Ledesma.
Zaporizhdal, a Soviet-era steel plant in the southern Ukrainian city of Zaporizhia, has kept running throughout the war in defiance of staff shortages, blocked exports, power blackouts, and the threat of Russian missile attacks. Sean Hogan with Reuters has the story.
The steel plant hums on against the backdrop of war. But Ukraine's steel industry, the future of 30% of the country's exports and 10% of its GDP, is in doubt. This plant in Zaporizhia, run by Roman Slobodianuk, isn't giving up.
Тож це одна з тих сфер економіки, яка
It is the economic sector that suffered the most from the war.
постраждала.
Almost 50% of the entire sector is not functioning today.
Вона на сьогоднішній день не функціонує.
In Soviet times, Ukraine produced more than 55 million tons of steel annually. That fell to 23 million by 2021. And after Russia invaded last year, output was just 6.9 million in 2022. as plants were taken over or destroyed, although domestic demand has doubled as Ukraine churns out weapons and builds bomb shelters, as well as rebuilding towns. But despite what is produced, moving it is the problem. Russia continues to pose a threat to shipments in the vital corridor through the Black Sea.
70 to 80% of the sector, mainly the metal industry, agriculture, the consumer goods industry, used to export their goods via seaports. There were many of them in the Black Sea. But after occupation, we had to adapt and use rail transport.
But rail is 4 times more expensive. Russia has damaged 40% of Ukraine's power network, leading to production losses from shutdowns. The labour market is also squeezed. Zaporizhia is only 31 miles from the front line and Europe's largest nuclear plant, which is now under Russia's control. The plant has lost 20% of its 10,000-strong workforce since Russia invaded.
Many workers have left and serve at the front line. Both senior and younger workers have left. Some of them serve at the Zaporizhia front, others serve at the Donetsk front.
Sean Hogan reporting for Reuters. Ukrainian students at Yale University are raising money for the armed forces of Ukraine and helping to educate fellow students about the situation in their homeland. Irina Solomko has the story, narrated by Anna Rice.
Ukraine's former finance minister Natalia Yereska is talking about her country's economic recovery from the war. She's speaking at Yale University's Jackson School of Global Affairs at an event organized by a student organization called Ukraine House.
Today I'm talking to students who are just forming their worldview, and I tell them how we see the world, why Ukrainians fight, why they need to keep fighting.
Yareska's daughter Darina Finglus is a Yale student and a co-director of events at Ukraine House. She says her home is Kiev, but she was attending Yale University when Russia invaded Ukraine.
I couldn't be idle and not do anything. I knew I could do something useful because I love Ukraine and I want to go back and live there again.
Another Ukraine House member, Yevgenia Podorets, says that most Ukrainian students at Yale belong to the student organization.
Everyone contributes in their own way, does something useful for the organization. Someone is helping spread information, others bring materials for fundraising.
One of the main goals of Ukraine House is to raise funds for Ukraine. The organization's vice president, Yuri Statsuk, says that is becoming more difficult.
It was easy at the start of Russia's invasion. Back then, everyone seemed to be doing something for Ukraine. But now we need to make a lot more effort to reach the same results.
To raise funds, members organize various events and parties. During Halloween, they will talk about the Slavic traditions linked to the holidays, as well as sell motankas, traditional Ukrainian dolls, and bracelets from the Azovstal steel plant.
By buying this, Americans can help Ukraine and get a souvenir that will serve as a reminder of what Ukrainians went through and keep going through.
The group plans to organize a large conference to mark the second anniversary of Russia's invasion and discuss rebuilding Ukraine, says Daria Valska.
I'd like to bring to Yale Ukrainian students from a number of U.S. universities, so we can unite for this event.
Ukraine House members also want to shift how the academic world looks at Eastern European studies and make sure it's not necessarily through the prism of learning about Russia. For Irina Solomka in New Haven, Connecticut, Anna Rice, VOA News.
And that'll do it for us today. Stay up to date with continuing coverage of Ukraine and news from around the world 24 hours a day at voanews.com. And on social media, just follow VOA News. On behalf of all of us here at VOA, we thank you so much for listening. Until next time, I'm VOA's Lori London.
We have strengthened our force posture in the region. We're continually watching to make sure that any actor who might be tempted to jump in here knows that we will take very seriously our national security interests in the region.
Plus, Turkey's president tries to thread the needle diplomatically.
I think such statements basically symbolize that the rapprochement is over. I think that's quite clear, that this normalization process that started in 2022 is now over.
And later, VOA is at the Jenin refugee camp, and King Charles heads off to visit a former colony. Today is Tuesday, October 31st, and this is VOA's International Edition. From VOA headquarters in Washington, I'm Steve Karish. We'll chat with our reporter at the Jenin refugee camp in a few minutes. First, though, this update. Israeli ground forces pushed deeper into Gaza on Monday, advancing in tanks and armored vehicles on the territory's main city and freeing a soldier that was held captive by Hamas militants. The Israeli Prime Minister rejected calls for a ceasefire as airstrikes landed near hospitals, where thousands of Palestinians are sheltering beside the wounded. Israel's attacks are in response to the Hamas militant group's stunning October 7th attack on civilians that left about 1,400 Israelis dead. But as Israel brings the fight to this tiny, crowded strip of land, officials from Washington, Moscow, Tehran, and Ankara are weighing in. VOA's Anita Powell reports from the White House.
The White House says it welcomes the limited flow of humanitarian aid and the restoration of telecommunications in Gaza as Israel continues its ground offensive on the enclave in response to militant group Hamas's October 7th attack. The Biden administration also is repeating its warning to armed groups to stay out of the fight.
Our message to any actor seeking to exploit this conflict is don't do it. And as you all know, we have strengthened our force posture in the region. We're continually watching to make sure that any actor who might be tempted to jump in here knows that we will take very seriously our national security interests in the region, not to mention our obligation to protect our troops and our facilities that are going after ISIS in places like Iraq and Syria.
But this conflict is also exploding in the court of public opinion. Hundreds of people stormed an airport in Russia's Dagestan region over the weekend, shouting anti-Semitic slurs over the arrival of a flight from Tel Aviv. Russia's president blamed the events on foreign interference, a move Kirby dismissed as classic Russian rhetoric.
The events in Makhachkala last night were inspired, including through social networks, not least from the territory of Ukraine, by the agents of Western intelligence services.
And Turkey's president has dug in on his disagreement with the U.S.'s classification of Hamas as a terror group and has shifted blame elsewhere.
The West has the biggest responsibility for the massacre in Gaza.
Iranian officials have piled on as well. That nation's foreign minister took to the rostrum at the United Nations last week to outline their view. Iranians have also protested on the streets.
It has been 3 weeks that we have been witness to the war crimes and genocide of the occupying Israeli regime in Gaza and the West Bank of Palestine. The United States and several European countries have sided with the occupying regime of Israel without observing the UN Charter and international law.
Kirby says the White House believes there's a fine line between disagreement and discord, and says the administration is vigilant over outbreaks of anti-Semitism.
No, we believe in the right of peaceful protest, even if it's, espousing ideas we don't agree with. But nobody wants to see peaceful protest turn violent or turn dangerous, the way that this mob activity did in Dagestan yesterday. So it's of concern, and it's something that we'll continue to talk about with our allies and partners.
But it's also something that increasingly the White House is facing at home, as protests, many supportive of Palestinians and critical of Israel, have bubbled up at major U.S. universities in recent weeks. Anita Powell, VOA News, the White House.
As we've heard, Israel's military, having entered Gaza over the weekend, continues to push deeper into the enclave. And on Monday, Israeli forces entered the Jenin refugee camp in the West Bank as they search for suspects linked to Hamas. VOA's Rick Pantaleo spoke with correspondent Linda Gradstein in Jerusalem, who provides an update on the conflict.
Israel has been saying for a while now that it could not eradicate Hamas solely with airstrikes, and that the airstrikes were only to prepare the ground for a wider ground offensive, which began over the weekend and intensified today. That means that tanks and troops pushed into northern Gaza. They got to the outskirts of Gaza City before withdrawing just a bit, and they were accompanied by continuing Israeli airstrikes. This is still not, however, the very large ground invasion that a lot of people are saying Israel is going to have to do if it really wants to fight Hamas. Hamas has a network of underground tunnels. They're holding 239 Israeli hostages. And that conflict, if they really want to continue to fight Hamas and to eradicate Hamas, as Israeli officials say, is going to take probably several months.
And finally, Linda, Israeli forces on Monday stormed the Jenin refugee camp in the West Bank as they searched for suspects linked to Hamas.
Yes, there was heavy fighting in Jenin. I mean, Jenin has been one of the flashpoints of violence between Israel and the Palestinians for a long time now. But it seems to be that Israel is conducting these raids in the West Bank, has arrested more than 1,000 people over these past 3 weeks, and there are almost daily clashes. There's also been an increase in violence by Jewish settlers who are living in the West Bank against Palestinians. One Jewish settler, in fact, was just arrested for killing a Palestinian under disputed circumstances.
As we've just heard from Linda Gradstein in Jerusalem, the Jenin refugee camp in the West Bank was the site of intense military action on Monday. VOA's Jan Boychat is there.
The violence keeps escalating here in the West Bank. Since October the 7th, in the attack of Hamas against Israel, more than 120 Palestinians were killed here, most of them by the Israeli forces, but some of them by Jewish settlers. Last night, the Israeli forces just stormed Jenin camp and killed 4 people. Here you can see it's the entrance of the camp, and it was destroyed by Israeli bulldozers. In the last days, Israeli forces are attacking this camp, coming here to try to arrest people they say are linked to Hamas. Last Friday, they also attacked here. There were some confrontation, and 3 people were killed as well. At that day as well, the Israeli forces just destroyed a monument in honor of the Al Jazeera reporter Shirin Abu that was killed in 2022. I'm Jan Boychat from the Jenin camp for VOA News.
And here are other stories we're following from around the world. President Joe Biden issued an executive order Monday on regulating artificial intelligence, aiming to manage the technology's risks. The order directs federal agencies to set new safety standards for AI systems and require developers to share their safety test results and other critical information with the U.S. government. Chinese President Xi Jinping said women have a critical role and must establish a new trend of family. This as the nation grapples with an aging population and a record decline in the birth rate. He added that it's necessary to actively cultivate a new culture of marriage and childbearing and strengthen guidance on young people's view on marriage, childbirth, and family. And the number of internally displaced people within the Democratic Republic of Congo has reached a record 6.9 million due to escalating violence, the UN said on Monday. The conflict between rebels and militias loyal to the government has intensified in the eastern province of North Kivu since early October. The UN's International Organization for Migration said many people who have fled their homes but stayed within the DRC's borders desperately need help to meet their basic needs. Diplomats around the world are working to try to find a way to end, or at least lessen, the conflict between Israel and Hamas. It seems that in every quarter of the world, leaders and groups are being asked to pick a side, knowing full well that whatever they say will be met with anger from someone. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan is facing a similar situation. Denounce Hamas as terrorists and lose the support of his base at home, or support Hamas as liberators and lose international support at a critical time. He chose to back Hamas at a recent rally, prompting Israel to withdraw its diplomats. However, in a move analysts believe is aimed at mitigating criticism by Western allies, Erdogan has also taken a step to ratify Sweden's NATO membership. However, experts warn Erdogan may have miscalculated. Dorian Jones reports from Istanbul.
At a mass rally in Istanbul Saturday, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan stepped up his support of Hamas, declaring again that Hamas is not a terrorist organization, but a liberation movement. The Turkish leader went on to warn that Turkey may come in the night to Gaza, with the crowd chanting to send the Turkish military. In response to Erdogan's statements, Israel has recalled its diplomats from Turkey, setting back the country's newly restored diplomatic relations. Galia Lindenstrauss is an analyst with the Institute for National Security Studies in Tel Aviv.
I think such statements basically symbolize that the rapprochement is over. I think that's quite clear, that this normalization process that started in 2022 is now over.
Last month in New York, Erdogan met for the first time with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. In the aftermath of Hamas's attack on Israel, Erdogan initially toned down his rhetoric as he sought to play a mediating role. But with Ankara appearing to be diplomatically sidelined, Erdogan stepped up his public support for Hamas. Columnist İlhan Üzgel for Turkey's Kısa Dalga news portal.
He decided that it doesn't make any difference for his regional role, so he could play the domestic game instead of a futile attempt to be a mediator in this conflict.
With opposition parties in Turkey protesting nationwide against Israel's Gaza assault, Erdogan's escalating rhetoric is also seen as an attempt to avoid being politically outflanked and to keep his religious base on his side. But in a gesture to his Western allies, the Turkish leader last week sent to Parliament a bill for the ratification of Sweden's NATO membership, which Turkey has been delaying. Some experts claim Erdogan is seeking to perform a balancing act. Sezin Öner of Politikyol news portal.
There he plays for the public, the local electorate and the Muslim populations. And he's also giving something to the West with Sweden's NATO membership. But I don't think that would work that way because he's making very, very fiery statements, bashing the US, bashing Israel. It's going far beyond that. It's advocating Hamas.
With Israeli forces stepping up their offensive in Gaza, experts say Israel has been measured in its response to Erdogan, with the priority being containment of the conflict. Galia Lindenstrauss is an analyst with the Institute for National Security Studies in Tel Aviv.
Israel doesn't need to add to the current tense situation with its neighbors, also tensions with Turkey. So I think the Israeli government will do all its best not to enter into direct confrontation with Turkey. Yes, it will listen to the rhetoric very carefully, and it will see what Turkey does.
As the conflict escalates, Turkey's Western allies have largely ignored Erdogan's rhetoric. But some experts warn his words of support of Hamas are unlikely to be forgotten. Dorian Jones, VOA News, Istanbul.
From Washington, it's VOA's International Edition. I'm Steve Karish. We're off to the slums of Mumbai in a moment. Now, though, Britain's King Charles begins a 4-day tour of Kenya on Tuesday. It's his first trip to Africa since becoming king, following the death of his mother, Queen Elizabeth, last year. Among his objectives is addressing what Buckingham Palace officials describe as painful aspects of Britain's colonial past with the East African nation. He'll also discuss issues related to the climate crisis and the importance of national security. VOA's Nairobi bureau chief, Miriama Diallo, has the story.
Kenya holds symbolic significance for Charles' family because of what it represented for his late mother.
Kenya is where the Queen's reign, Queen Elizabeth II, King Charles's mother, it's where her reign began. She learned that her father died in Kenya. And somewhat conversely, although the post-independence period has had its ups and downs, the UK and Kenya have maintained some very close ties.
Olivia O'Sullivan says there are many shared priorities between the two governments.
There are ties between their militaries. They share military training on occasion. There's more recently, the UK has kind of sought to position itself as a bit of a leader in tackling climate change, particularly the last COP, which the UK hosted in Glasgow. And Kenya too, President Ruto in particular, has sought a leading voice and a leadership role on climate change.
King Charles and President William Ruto are expected to discuss the climate crisis, the importance of conservation efforts, and working together on national security, the King's Deputy Private Secretary, Chris Fitzgerald, said earlier this month. This trip comes as the African nation celebrates 60 years of independence from Britain.
If we're to look back with the benefit of retrospect, we would say that the history that's shared between Kenya and the United Kingdom, in the very first part, is a very violent kind of memory.
Javas Bigamba recalls Kenya's hard-fought struggle against British colonialism.
There was the issue of picking up or taking up the land of the locals when Kenya was British protectorate from 1901, through the time of the struggle for independence, the Mau Mau struggle, where a number of Kenyans suffered in the hands of the British.
10 years ago, Britain apologized and agreed to pay compensation to thousands of veterans of the Mau Mau nationalist uprising in Kenya, which was brutally suppressed by the British colonial government in the 1950s. The Kenya Human Rights Commission estimated that 90,000 Kenyans were killed and 160,000 detained. King Charles will spend 4 days in Kenya, 2 in Nairobi and 2 in the coastal city of Mombasa. While in Nairobi, he'll meet with President Ruto, tour Uhuru Gardens, and attend a banquet at the State House, among many other planned activities. Mariama Jallow, VOA News, Nairobi.
And finally today, in India's financial capital, Mumbai plans to revamp one of the world's largest slums into a modern city hub has raised concerns about how the redevelopment will impact the livelihoods of tens of thousands of people. But there's also optimism about improving conditions for those living there. Anjana Pasricha spoke to residents in Dharavi, the Mumbai slum that was featured in the movie Slumdog Millionaire.
Abdul Qadir Ansari aspires to develop this tailoring workshop into a bigger business. He opened it 4 years ago in Dharavi in Mumbai. But an ambitious $3 billion plan to pull down the world's largest slum and resettle residents in buildings worries him. Ansari says his workshop in Dharavi will have to close during rebuilding. He does not know if he will be given an alternate place to run his business. The government has awarded a contract to the Adani Group to overhaul Dharavi, which sprawls over 250 hectares of prime real estate in the heart of Mumbai. The slum is home to 1 million people. After residents are relocated, residential and commercial complexes are expected to be built on the space that is freed up. Some, like Dharavi resident Pramod Khade, are optimistic about exchanging their dismal living conditions for modern flats. He says his father and great-grandfather stayed here, but his generation dreams of living in a building. But many feared that Dharavi's revamp could cost them their livelihoods. Over decades, hundreds of workshops have sprung up in narrow alleys and courtyards, making products such as leather bags and pottery. These informal businesses produce goods worth an estimated $1 billion. Potters say they need open spaces to work. Pottery shop owner in Dharavi, Jaya Behen, worries about how her family will manage if its pottery business has to shut down. She says people like her cannot get jobs and no one will employ her at this age. She is not educated, and only the educated get jobs. Entrepreneur Megha Gupta works with leather craftsmen in Dharavi. She has organized workshops to improve their skills, and her online platform helps them access more customers.
People over here work to survive. They're not really thriving. It is because they work on very low margins.
Gupta is confident that Dharavi's redevelopment will involve resettling the businesses.
You cannot take 1 million people out of their place and tell them, okay, just go work somewhere else. They are considering it. But it's going to be a difficult project. Nowhere in the world something like this has happened.
Residents say they have not been consulted so far about the proposed revamp. They are clear about what they want. Leather craftsman Satyavan Maruti Kamble says there is a workshop on top of every house in Dharavi, so the development must ensure that they have homes and workplaces. Tailoring workshop owner Ansari has similar concerns. He says Dharavi is a very central place for his work and his main market. He is tense because he could be relocated out of Mumbai. Those tensions will persist for many until they know what the future holds. Anjana Pasricha, VOA News, Mumbai.
And that's going to wrap it up for us today. This has been International Edition on the Voice of America. On behalf of everyone at VOA, thanks for joining us. For pictures, stories, videos, and more, follow VOA News on your favorite social media platform and online at voanews.com. Until next time, I'm Steve Karish in Washington. Stay safe and have a great day.
Next, an editorial reflecting the views of the United States government.
Honduras and the United States share many common objectives, said Deputy Assistant Secretary for Central America and Western Hemisphere Affairs Eric Jacobstein in recent congressional testimony. The election of Honduran President Xiomara Castro in 2021 presented an opportunity to break with the corruption and democratic backsliding, said Deputy Assistant Secretary Jacobstein.
Honduras has committed to addressing corruption and impunity, and President Castro has invited the UN to establish an independent anti-corruption commission. We applaud this effort, but we urge its rapid establishment in accordance with UN guidelines. And we also urge the government to fund existing units that investigate corruption.
We applaud Honduras' progress in passing legislation regarding internally displaced persons and also for working with the United States on enforcement efforts, stated Deputy Assistant Secretary Jacobstein. The United States has a long-standing history of security cooperation with Honduras, including through a U.S. presence in Sotocano Air Base. We look forward to continuing this cooperation with Honduras, said Deputy Assistant Secretary Jacobstein. But he had a word of caution regarding relations with the People's Republic of China.
The Honduran government states its foreign policies to meet its international cooperation needs by opening the door to new countries, including the People's Republic of China. While we acknowledge that diplomatic recognition is a sovereign decision, we note the PRC often makes promises in exchange for recognition that ultimately remain unfulfilled.
With regard to the economy, the United States aims to mobilize additional investment under Vice President Kamala Harris's Central America Forward initiative, which has already brought $4.2 billion in investment commitments and new jobs in Northern and Central America. Future commitments, stressed Deputy Assistant Secretary Jacobstein, will depend on a favorable investment climate and sound economic decisions. Human rights activists in Honduras continue to work under threat of violence and death, noted Deputy Assistant Secretary Jacobstein.
We continue to call upon the Honduran government to protect activists like Miriam Miranda, Jose Romero Lara, who face serious threats, and to complete timely and transparent investigations into killing of activists like Jairo Bonilla and Ali Dominguez.
The situation in Honduras is complex, said Deputy Assistant Secretary Jacobstein, but we remain committed to a strong bilateral relationship given our two countries' cultural, economic, familial, and geographic ties.
That was an editorial reflecting the views of the United States government.
Administration officials make the case to Congress for aid to Ukraine and Israel.
Committee will suspend, and I again ask that those in the audience respect the people in the room and allow us to continue the hearing. The hearing will suspend until the disruption is removed.
Plus, fighting intensifies across Ukraine as Russian attacks continue targeting energy infrastructure.
The region where one of the biggest nuclear power plant is located, and this power plant is extremely important at this period as winter is coming, because the Parisian nuclear power plant is currently not operating.
And later in the program, efforts to preserve Ukraine's heritage as Russia looks to wipe it off the map. Today is Tuesday, October 31st. From the Voice of America, this is Flashpoint Ukraine. Good evening, I'm Lori London in Washington. Two of President Joe Biden's top advisors asked U.S. lawmakers to provide billions more dollars to Ukraine and Israel Tuesday at a congressional hearing interrupted repeatedly by protesters denouncing American officials for backing what they called genocide against Palestinians in Gaza.
We're standing up for our interests and values, not shrinking back, not in the face of Russia's aggression against Ukraine, not in the face of an intensifying strategic competition in the Indo-Pacific and around the world.
If the witness will suspend, and I ask that everyone again respect this hearing, we will suspend until the room is clear.
Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Defense Chief Lloyd Austin testified to the Senate Appropriations Committee on Biden's request for $106 billion to fund ambitious plans for Ukraine, Israel, and U.S. border security.
As in so much that we do to advance America's national security, our defense, our diplomacy, our development must work hand in hand.
I say no more. Committee will suspend. And again, I appreciate that people feel passionately about these issues. I would ask that you respect our witnesses and our committee members and allow the American people to hear their testimony.
Arguing that supporting U.S. partners is vital to national security, President Biden requested $61.4 billion for Ukraine, making the case in a recent address to the American people.
We can't ignore the humanity of innocent Palestinians who only want to live in peace and have an opportunity. You know, the assault on Israel echoes nearly 20 months of war, tragedy, and brutality inflicted on the people of Ukraine, people that were very badly hurt since Putin launched his all-out invasion. We've not forgotten the mass graves, the bodies found bearing signs of torture, rape used as a weapon by the Russians, and thousands of Ukrainian children forcibly taken into Russia, stolen from their parents. It's sick. Hamas and Putin represent different threats, but they share this in common. They both want to completely annihilate a neighboring democracy, completely annihilate it.
Biden officials are working to convince skeptical Republicans. Associated Press correspondent Jennifer King has that part of the story.
It's a mostly friendly audience in the Senate, but there's deeper resistance in the House, where the new Republican Speaker, Mike Johnson, has voiced concerns about fiscal stability and proposed focusing on Israel alone and cutting funding for the IRS to pay for it. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, reacting to the $14 billion House proposal, said democracy and freedom are under attack around the globe and that Republicans should resist the false allure of isolationism. Senate opponents of the massive aid package include Ohio Senator J.D. Vance, who describes the Ukraine war as an endless conflict with no plan from the Biden administration. Jennifer King, Washington.
Meanwhile, Ukraine's presidential office reports fierce fighting. Associated Press correspondent Charles de Ledesma has the latest on deadly attacks in the southern part of the country.
In the south, the Russian army shelled the Kherson region almost 100 times, killing a woman while visiting a cemetery. In Kherson city, as a result of the shelling of a bus with passengers, 5 people were wounded and residential areas and a library building were damaged. The attack on vital infrastructure in the south cut power in 4 towns in the region, including Slav, where 2 civilians were injured. The Russians have intensified attacks on the Donetsk region, where battles for Avdiivka are taking place, shelling 19 towns and villages. I'm Charles de Ledesma.
And beyond the south, there have been intensifying Russian attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure in other parts of the country. For further insights on the ground, I spoke with Anna Chernikova in Kyiv.
The main target was Khmelnytska region, which is in the west part of the country, and also Mykolaiv region, which is in the south. What's interesting to mention here is that Khmelnytska region is a region where one of the biggest nuclear power plant is located, and this power plant is extremely important at this period as winter is coming, first of all, and second of all, because the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant is currently not operating. And some time before, we already discussed that Russian forces basically conducted shelling very close to this Khmelnytska nuclear power plant. And now again, we are getting reports on the attack in that region. This is something, new reports on the attacks in the Khmelnytsky region creates additional risk for the energy infrastructure. Additionally, there are reports of attack on the electricity infrastructure in Donetsk region, and at this point we have confirmation that that certain area in Donetsk region is currently has electricity cut.
And it sounds like Ukrainian forces are looking to make some serious changes and advances in the Bakhmut area. What can you tell us about that?
We have reports from the area of Bakhmut that was confirmed by the commander of the ground forces of Ukraine. We are hearing that Russian troops significantly strengthened their grouping and switch from defense to active actions in that area. This was confirmed by the Ukrainian armed forces. The Russian forces are also trying to advance in several directions at once in the Kupiansk region, which is in the area of Kharkiv. And we can see that basically Eastern Front line in general is getting more active. However, at the same time, Alexander Syrsky confirmed that the defense of the Ukrainian forces is quite successful at this point, but still it's extremely difficult for Ukrainian forces to get this defense done. But he confirmed that heavy losses are reported from the Russian side, from Ukrainian side as well. We're hearing, it's not confirmed officially, but we're hearing that losses are also quite high. And at this point, both Ukrainian and Russian army is moving back and forward, and certain actions are expected in sometime soon.
Anna Chernikova reporting for VOA from Kyiv. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Ukraine's parliament overwhelmingly voted last week to advance legislation seen as effectively banning the Ukrainian Orthodox Church over its ties to Moscow. The church insists it's fully independent and supportive of Ukraine's fight against Russian invaders. VOA Eastern Bureau Chief Miroslava Gangadze spoke with Viktor Yelensky, Ukrainian religious scholar at Kyiv University, ahead of this week's deadline to put the amendment to law.
Ukrainian parliament last week voted to regulate the function of Orthodox Church, and many foreign media wrote that it's a ban on Orthodox Church over alleged links with Russia. How would you assess this new legislation?
Well, it's not legislation, it's just a bill, and it was only first hearing, and this bill stipulates that religious organization with the center in Russia couldn't operate in Ukraine. On April 11 this year, All Ukrainian Council of Churches and Religious Organization addressed to the head of the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine and said that no one organization, both civil and religious, cannot operate in Ukraine if it has its own center in the country which waged war against Ukraine. Secondly, this is not a ban, this is regulation. Regulation means that state service of freedom of conscience and ethnic affairs provide examination, and if this examination proves that this or that religious organization has its own center in the country which waged military aggression against Ukraine, state service addressed to this organization with special prescription. And if a religious organization rejected to comply with the law, state service turned to the court. So the last word would be for civil court. This is not a ban. Once again, this is a regulation.
The majority of discussions with this new regulations centered around Lavra Church, one of the oldest Ukrainian church, and its real estate, and why Lavra is important for Ukraine, and what is the significance of Lavra for Ukraine?
Kiev-Pечерska Lavra is the oldest and most probably sacral site in Eastern Orthodoxy in Europe. Within many years, Kiev-Pечерska Lavra has been a sort of nestle of Russian world in the center of Ukrainian capital. There were signs like no schismatics, Catholics, and dogs allowed to be in this or that cathedral. Now, Kiev-Pечерska Lavra gradually turned to the center of Ukrainian spirituality. And some, probably a couple of weeks ago, it was the first prayer for Hetman Mazepa in Lavra, for Hetman Mazepa, who founded many churches in plural in Kiev-Pечерska Lavra and was anatomized by Russian church. A couple months ago, it was Brposky liturgy sounded in Kiev-Pечерska Lavra. So now monastery, Kiev-Pечерska Lavra, monastery of Moscow Patriarchate, turned into court about its presence in the territory of Kiev-Pечерska Lavra, and now the court up to make decision about its future.
What would you say to those critics and those who belong to Russian Orthodox Church, though they call themselves Ukrainian Orthodox Church now? What would you say to those who say that Ukrainian government on Ukraine is actually restricting religious freedom?
I would say that it's not about religious freedom. It's about national security. It's about human rights. It's about civil obedience. Subordination to Moscow Patriarchate is not a part of Orthodox teaching. The Ukrainian government just asked hierarchy of Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Moscow Patriarchate to stop ties to Moscow Patriarchate. Moscow Patriarchate turned out to be the member of military corps of Russian Federation, and about 1,000 theologians, universities, professors signed a petition about the heresy of Russian world teaching, because Patriarch Kirill elaborated the special teaching, anti-Western, anti-Ukrainian, and anti-Christian teaching about Russian world, completely military and chauvinistic dogma, which try to use in our country. We try to do this policy, stop links with Moscow Patriarchate in such a way that won't be caused any damage, any harm to the freedom of religion and to the conscience of every single parishioners.
How do you assess the possibility of passing this law, and how long do you think those monks and priests in Lavra would be barricaded themselves in the church?
Democratic procedure is long, actually. But every single day I had conversation with monks, with priests, with bishops of Ukrainian Church of Moscow Patriarchate who are not happy with politics of their hierarchs and with the politics of Moscow Patriarchate. And 400 of them petitioned Metropolitan Onufry, the head of Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Moscow Patriarchate, and asked him to convene the council and to finally break the ties with Moscow Patriarchate, which is participant of aggression.
Viktor Yelensky, Ukrainian religious scholar at Kyiv University, speaking with VOA Eastern Europe Bureau Chief Miroslava Gangadze. You're listening to VOA's Flashpoint Ukraine. I'm Lori London. Without evidence, President Vladimir Putin accused the West and Ukraine of stirring up unrest inside Russia after rioters in the predominantly Muslim Dagestan region stormed an airport to, quote, catch Jewish passengers in a flight from Tel Aviv. White House National Security spokesman John Kirby addressed Putin's accusation.
It's classic Russian rhetoric, isn't it? When something goes like bad in your country, you just blame somebody else, blame it on outside influences. The West had nothing to do with this. This is just hate, bigotry, and intimidation, pure and simple. And a good leader, a decent leader, would call it out for what it is, the way President Biden has called it out here in this country, instead of blaming the West.
More than 1,000 people descended on the airport on the night of October 29th, seeking to prevent passengers arriving on a flight from Israel from entering the city.
A chilling demonstration of hate, bigotry, intimidation. Some people have compared it to the pogroms of the late 19th and early 20th century, and I think that's probably an apt description, given that video that we've seen out there.
And Kirby noted there has been no condemnation from Russia or calling for an end to the bigotry and hatred aimed at Jews. As Russia continues its invasion of Ukraine, organizations are working to preserve its heritage and its history, something Moscow appears to want to erase. I spoke with Katerina Goncharova, Ukrainian heritage crisis specialist with the World Monuments Fund, on their efforts to protect Kyiv's historically significant sites.
One of the projects that WMF is supporting is damage assessment project, because there were numerous initiatives of damage assessment using satellite images, accessible information, publicly available information, social media sources, and all things like this. But the point is that there were not a single group of experts who would do that on site. And that was one of our initiatives to support multidisciplinary groups that would conduct expeditions on the ground to actually see what had been damaged, what is the scale of damage, what was ruined, destroyed, what steps could we undertake to mitigate this damage and things like this. So we're funding this super gigantic, really strategic project, because according to UNESCO, the number of damaged sites is just literally not that big. According to the Ministry of Culture, it's up to 835 historic buildings that had been damaged. But we still do not have access to occupied territories, Crimea, Eastern Ukraine, where anyone who would give us that information would be under really serious threat. So the damage assessment is organized in two different directions, but by our partners. And we're supporting one that is related to stabilization, preservation, and reconstruction and rehabilitation. So we do need this information to strategize, to see what's happening on the ground, if communities are active, if the site can be preserved, and for whom it should be preserved. Because this absolutely dystopian scenario of Ukrainian identity that is being erased, as you mentioned in our communication previously, it actually puts us in a very challenging situation when we have to preserve what we have in order for people who are coming back, who are returning to Ukraine, who are returning to their home, to feel connection to know that there is a lot of people who are taking care about them. There are a lot of people who are taking care not only about their safety, basic comfort, education, healthcare, and things like that, but there are also a lot of international donors who are willing to support those markers of their identity. And this is why we're absolutely committed to stabilize and restore and rehabilitate those sites that are valuable for local communities.
Can you give us a few examples of some of the sites that have particular significance, historic significance, that have been damaged?
There were a lot of damage to historic sites on the territories that had been occupied. For now, we're talking about herbicide, when the whole historic city is being almost erased, if not almost erased, then the attempt was very vivid. For example, we're talking about Kharkiv, we're talking about Sumy, we're talking about Kherson, really big, gigantic cities that have layers and layers of historic heritage embodied in urban environment, in architectural sites that had been directly damaged or were indirectly affected by military actions. I would talk about, and Odessa, of course, I would talk about UNESCO sites, on those that are on a tentative list. In Kharkiv, I would talk about the whole city of Odessa that was acknowledged as UNESCO World Heritage Site in risk, in danger. And of course, I would definitely mention the first attempts of Russians of deliberate attacks on Ukrainian heritage, like the Museum of Marina Primachenko in Kiev region, like Museum of Skovoroda in Kharkiv region, about the Library of Youth Museum of Ukrainian Antiquities in Chernigiv. So there's a lot of sites that had been damaged, and there's a lot of them that bear Ukrainian identity and the unique code of Ukrainian culture that were almost erased.
As an organization, I know that World Monuments Fund is committed to safeguarding global heritage. Tell us what the destruction of a cultural heritage does for the world and for the peoples where it's being wiped away.
Well, for some people, historic sites is the place that is related to their personal life, to their everyday life, something that they see and started to cherish absolutely preciously when the risk increased. The risk of losing what you have, the risk of losing what you love increases enormously every day since the war started. So people started taking care of their sites, taking care of their heritage, museum collections, libraries, buildings. And one of the most vivid example of how community takes care about the site that they love is one of our project, Museum of Local History in Ohtyrka. A year ago, we received an application from museum to basically stabilize the structure that almost collapsed. So we helped them to put a new permanent roof, and it became a really strong point, a really trigger point for local community to basically to believe in themselves. And they applied again because they wanted to rehabilitate the basement. They saw a museum as a social center, as a community center, as the center where they can come and talk about things that they're worried about. So since Ohtyrka, that's not that big city, is located not far away from Russian-Ukrainian border, we decided to rehabilitate the basement that would serve not only as a community center, but also as a very safe bomb shelter. So for now, this cultural institution bears a number of functions and serves not only as a museum, as a cultural center, but also as a safe location and a community center where they will have more events, meetings, seminars, educational programs, and everything they can to provide any assistance to the local community and for locals.
It must hurt emotionally when you're not just an attack on your lives, but also on who you are as a people.
Every time I talk to Ukrainian cultural workers, museum workers, librarians, historians, architects, those people mainly act not based on their personal interests, like saving their lives, saving their families. We're in a very early stage of our work, even though we're working in Ukraine for more than a year and a half, because while the war is still ongoing, we have to absolutely must stick to the criteria of safety. And it sometimes have our hands bound because we need to make sure that people we're working with on the ground will be safe and healthy and return to their families and their loved ones. But of course, we're all looking forward for post-war recovery, because this is something where we definitely would like to go on with our stabilization and our work in Ukraine, preserving cultural heritage, providing assistance to Ukrainian cultural workers. And of course, we're in the very, very beginning. There will be a lot of things to discuss and to talk about, hopefully in the nearest future.
Katerina Goncharova, Ukrainian Heritage Crisis Specialist with the World Monuments Fund. And that'll do it for us today. Stay up to date with continuing coverage on Ukraine and news from around the world, 24 hours a day at voanews.com. And on social media, just follow VOA News. On behalf of all of us here at VOA, we thank you so much for listening. Until next time, I'm VOA's Lori London.
Refugee camp.
In the course of the fighting, we eliminated many terrorists and destroyed terror infrastructure. This is complicated combat, some of which is face-to-face combat.
Plus, the Houthis in Yemen have stepped into a war 2,500 kilometers away.
On Tuesday, its military spokesperson said the launch was their third since the conflict began.
And later, a conversation with a correspondent in Jerusalem and a look at the economic impacts of Pakistan's decision to expel Afghan migrants. Today is Wednesday, November 1st, and this is VOA's International Edition. From VOA headquarters in Washington, I'm Steve Karish. An update on the U.S. Congress and President Joe Biden's request for more funding to help Israel and Ukraine in a moment. We begin, though, in Israel, where missiles could be seen falling onto Gaza on Tuesday night with explosions and occasional gunfire as the United States and other countries say they're looking at options for the future of the Strip. Israeli tanks have been active in Gaza for at least 4 days, following weeks of air bombardments. On Tuesday, airstrikes hit a densely populated refugee camp, killing at least 50 Palestinians, including a leader of Hamas. Military spokesperson Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari confirmed the airstrikes on Jabalia refugee camp and said it targeted a central Hamas stronghold.
Our forces are currently fighting deep inside the Gaza Strip. They are killing terrorists in close range combat, conducting coordinated strikes on terror targets from land, air, and sea. During the afternoon hours, infantry and armored forces secured a central Hamas stronghold in the west part of Jabalia. The stronghold served as a training center for the October 7th massacre and as a passage to the coastline from where additional terrorists set off to perpetrate the October 7th massacre. In the course of the fighting, we eliminated many terrorists and destroyed terror infrastructure. This is complicated combat, some of which is face-to-face combat. During the combat, we lost soldiers.
Palestinian health officials said at least 50 Palestinians were killed and 150 wounded in the incident. The Israeli military has accused Hamas of using civilian buildings as cover for fighters, commanders, and weaponry. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres appealed again on Tuesday for the protection of civilians caught in the conflict, stressing the need for proportional behavior and precautions by all parties. The UN and other aid officials said civilians in Gaza are suffering a public health catastrophe, with hospitals struggling to treat casualties as electricity supplies peter out. Meanwhile, despite worldwide diplomatic efforts to prevent the Israel-Hamas conflict from becoming a wider regional war, Yemen's Iran-backed Houthi movement confirmed on Tuesday that they fired drones and missiles at Israel in attacks that cement the world power's fears of the conflict widening into other countries. Reuters' Matthew Laratonda has that story.
The declaration came after Israel's military said it intercepted 2 objects in separate incidents around the Red Sea. This was a Houthi parade filmed by Reuters in Yemen in September, only days before the Hamas attacks on Israel. On Tuesday, its military spokesperson said the launch was their third since the conflict began, seeming to confirm that it was behind an incident on October 19th when the U.S. Navy said it had intercepted 3 cruise missiles over the Red Sea, and a drone attack on October 28th, which resulted in blasts in Egypt, blamed on the Houthis by Israel. The spokesperson said they would continue to launch against Israel until, quote, Israeli aggression ceases. The Houthis are part of what's called the Axis of Resistance, an alliance of armed groups backed by Iran and includes Hamas. It recently released this video said to show their military drills. Israel's military says it will remain focused on Gaza and that the Houthis are just one of many of Iran's proxies, a relationship that the Houthis have denied.
That's Reuters' Matthew Laratonda reporting. As the situation worsens in the Middle East, top Biden administration officials told U.S. lawmakers on Tuesday that the White House request for $106 billion in emergency supplemental funding, including aid for Ukraine and Israel, is vital to U.S. national security. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin testified as the request faces significant opposition in the Republican-majority U.S. House of Representatives. VOA's congressional correspondent Katherine Gibson has more.
U.S. officials pushing lawmakers Tuesday to move quickly to address war on two fronts, proposing $14.3 billion in U.S. aid to Israel and $61.4 billion in aid to Ukraine. U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin.
American leadership is what holds the world together. And if we fail to lead, the costs and threats to the United States will only grow.
Mike Johnson, the new Republican Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, released legislation late Monday separating aid to Ukraine from aid to Israel. That's a strategic error, according to U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken.
It would do both terrible harm to our values, but also to our core interests. Values because I think all of us are united in wanting to respond to aggressors, to bullies who try to lord it over their neighbors. And in the midst of doing that, inflict incredible suffering.
Opposition to a new round of funding for Ukraine to combat Russian aggression is broader in the House, the lower chamber of the U.S. Congress. But in the U.S. Senate, Minority Leader Mitch McConnell has been a key voice supporting continued aid to Ukraine.
Russia would love to see Iranian-backed terrorists in the Middle East weaken America and our allies. Iran would love to see a Russian victory against Ukraine that divides the West and deepens its own defense cooperation with Moscow.
Some Republican senators remain concerned, arguing there is not sufficient oversight of the aid and that the U.S. cannot indefinitely fund a war. Republican Senator John Hoeven.
We need to know that we have a strategy as part of this funding. I think it's very important in terms of building support for the funding for Ukraine.
Members of the Democratic majority Senate would likely block a standalone Israel bid, arguing it must be paired with aid to the Ukraine as requested by the White House. National Security spokesperson John Kirby.
It doesn't meet our national security needs. And as Commander-in-Chief, the president's never going to do anything. It doesn't meet our key national security needs.
Austin said not providing aid to Ukraine could ultimately lead to a U.S. confrontation with Russian President Vladimir Putin.
There's no question in my mind that sooner or later there will be, he will challenge NATO and we'll find ourselves in a shooting match.
The House could vote on aid to Israel as soon as this Thursday, where there is some opposition to the aid among progressive Democrats. Blinken said assistance to Palestinians would be a key part of that aid.
Humanitarian assistance is also vital to Israel's security. Providing immediate aid and protection for Palestinian civilians in this conflict is a necessary foundation for finding partners in Gaza who have a different vision for the future than Hamas.
Both the White House and Republican aid requests include $10.6 billion in support for Israel's air and missile defense systems. Katherine Gibson, VOA News.
And in a late-breaking development Tuesday night, Joe Biden said he would veto a funding bill that separates Israel from Ukraine. And here are more stories we're following from around the world. Vietnam and Japan are poised to elevate their diplomatic ties to the highest level. It's a move that analysts say highlights the two countries' growing concern over China's assertive behavior in the region. A top prosecutor in Niger said on Tuesday that President Mohamed Bazoum, ousted in a coup, had sought to escape house arrest, which his lawyers deny. The alleged escape plan involved getting to a hideout on the outskirts of the capital, Niamey, before taking helicopters belonging to a, quote, foreign power toward Nigeria. This according to a regime spokesman on state television. And Saudi Arabia is all but certain to host the men's 2034 World Cup. This after the Australian Soccer Federation decided not to enter the bidding contest. FIFA had set Tuesday as the deadline to formally declare interest in hosting the tournament, but Australia's decision not to enter the race leaves Saudi Arabia as the only declared candidate, to the dismay of many human rights activists. The Israel Defense Forces, with help from the Israeli Security Agency, conducted an airstrike that killed an important member of Hamas. VOA's Rick Pantaleo spoke with correspondent Natasha Mosgovia in Jerusalem about who this important target was, his significance, as well as the airstrike itself. Here's what she had to say.
Well, this is part of the operation that goes, as you know, on the ground, also with aerial support, and Israel targets not only the groups of militants, their infrastructure, they're also trying to find and eliminate those directly responsible for different parts of the operation of the attack that Hamas conducted against Israel on October 7th. So Nassim Abu Ajuna, he's the commander of the Beit Lahia battalion of the Northern Division of Hamas. Probably people don't remember, but this person was already targeted in the past. So, say in May 2021, his house in Gaza was already basically demolished, attacked from air, because in his house, as IDF said back then, was militant infrastructure. So this is something that obviously, if he wasn't eliminated then, he wasn't at home, right? But it was a message from IDF that he is on their list of sort of mid-level management, if we can apply it to a terrorist organization in this case. So basically, Israel in this operation has several objectives, but definitely targeting figures that can be tied to the attack. And this person was responsible, relying on what IDF says, for the part of the aerial attack of Hamas, which was paragliders, and also some of the drones operations that Hamas started utilizing in recent years. So he was responsible for that and for basically direct orders to attack two of the kibbutzim in Israel. So he was confirmed dead. I assume, again, that it is based on intelligence sources, because it's an aerial strike to see something happening on the ground. Ground forces usually do not reach those places that fast. Otherwise, they would do it in the first place. But again, let's not go too deep into assumptions. We have information from the ground operation just trickling in, because IDF is obviously very cautious about revealing anything that might put its troops in further harm, because any picture, any location, it all can be used at this point against them. As we know, and as Hamas, I think, does not really hide, they have an extensive infrastructure. They're well prepared for guerrilla warfare or urban warfare.
Natasha, Israeli forces with their ground operations face a challenge that Hamas has military compounds within an extensive network of tunnels. How successful has Israel's operations been in dealing with Hamas in these tunnels?
We do not know this at this point. Again, as I said, Israel has been very cautious in releasing any information about the ongoing operation. Right now, basically, they just released 2 names of soldiers that were killed. But sometimes you need to read between the lines. And when we hear senior commanders of the army talking about, very kind of somberly about the price and versus the goal, etc. So it basically, that's how usually the people are being prepared for higher numbers of casualties. How successful, that's really hard to say, but we should again remind that today we have a new tally of hostages. And this complicates any operation on the ground to a great deal, because 240 people, mostly civilians, including very young children, are still held by Hamas.
VOA's Rick Pantaleo speaking with correspondent Natasha Mosgovia in Jerusalem. From Washington, it's VOA's International Edition. I'm Steve Karish. An economic view of Pakistan's expulsion of Afghan migrants in a moment. First, though, UN Security Council members received a briefing on the situation in Ukraine on Tuesday from Ramesh Rajasingham. He's the Director of Coordination for the UN's Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs.
While much of the international attention is rightly concentrated on the grave events in the Middle East, it is important that we do not lose focus on other crises, particularly not one as brutal and far-reaching as that precipitated by the war in Ukraine.
Rajasingham continued to say that because of the war, 80 million people need humanitarian assistance, and perhaps more troubling,
at the latest count, more than 9,900 civilians have been killed since the start of the invasion. To put this into perspective, this is equivalent to almost 16 civilians killed every day.
And in a related story, 3 Russians were arrested Tuesday in New York for evading U.S. sanctions to ship electronic components for weapons used by Russia in its war in Ukraine. The trio are accused of sending over 300 shipments of restricted items valued at approximately $10 million to the Russian battlefield. This, according to an agent with the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. The federal prosecutor's office said that more than $1.1 million in proceeds had been seized from domestic bank accounts. Components linked to the group's 2 Brooklyn-based companies have been found in seized Russian weapons platforms and signals intelligence equipment in Ukraine, including guided missile systems, drones, tanks, and helicopters, the Department of Justice said in a statement announcing the charges. And now to Central Africa, where millions have lost their homes in Congo's growing conflict. The AP's Charles de Ledesma reports.
The United Nations Migration Agency says a record 6.9 million people have been displaced by conflict across Congo, making it one of the world's largest displacement and humanitarian crises. The International Organization for Migration says the decades-long conflict has been the primary reason for this displacement. The area has long been overrun by dozens of armed groups seeking a share of the region's gold and other resources. Now, outside multinational forces deployed to help stop the violence are under pressure to leave as frustration grows. I'm Charles de Ledesma.
And finally today, as Afghans residing illegally in Pakistan leave on Islamabad's orders, many local business owners are seeing labor shortages and a decline in business activity. VOA's Pakistan Bureau Chief Sarah Zaman reports from the bulk produce market in Islamabad, where Afghans make up the majority of traders, vendors, and manual labor.
Mornings are always busy in the bulk vegetable and fruit market in Pakistan's capital, Islamabad. Hundreds of thousands of boxes of produce are unloaded from trucks every day and auctioned for sale across the city. The market relies heavily on Afghans. Haji Nader owns a business here.
All of our dealings are with our Afghan brothers. They also work as laborers here. There are those who buy from us and sell onwards. Nearly 77% of the people associated with this business here are Afghans.
But things are changing. The Pakistani government's directive ordering Afghans residing without proper documentation to leave the country voluntarily by October 31st or face a crackdown from November 1st spooked the market. Abdul Wahid is a trader.
I have 3 containers of produce waiting to be sold. It's been 15 days, and I haven't been able to sell even half a container. There's no buyer.
Nearly 1.7 million Afghans, many born in Pakistan, live illegally in the country, according to government data. Officials say nearly 200,000 have left in the last 2 months, fearing a crackdown. As Afghan businessmen figure out their future, their Pakistani counterparts like Najibullah are worried about their investments, which run hundreds of thousands of dollars. Business owner Najibullah is worried.
We don't do business in cash. It's all on credit. Afghans owe us money, and we owe them.
Fearing arrest, many Afghan laborers are skipping work. Nabi Khan works as a porter. His family has proper documentation, but his identification card has a hold on it.
I have spent my whole life here, and now I am facing this problem. It's possible that I will be separated from my family.
Lacking social protection, Afghans do grueling work for much less than their Pakistani counterparts, and vendors rely on them to keep costs low.
A shortage of cheap Afghan labor means the cost of business here could rise, and that can push up prices of produce for Pakistanis who are already dealing with sky-high inflation.
As Afghans leave in droves, finding trucks to transport produce is becoming hard, as vehicles are booked to move families with their belongings. With the pace of Afghan departures picking up, Pakistani businesses are bracing for major disruptions.
I'm losing sleep thinking how I will recover my money from another country if Afghans go back.
Over 4 million Afghans live in Pakistan, most of them legally. While many have faced crackdowns and eviction orders in the past, this is Pakistan's biggest deportation drive. Sara Zaman, VOA News, Islamabad.
And that's going to wrap it up for us today. This has been International Edition on the Voice of America. On behalf of everyone at VOA, thanks for joining us. For pictures, stories, videos, and more, follow VOA News on your favorite social media platform and online at voanews.com. Until next time, I'm Steve Karish in Washington. Stay safe and have a great day.
Next, an editorial reflecting the views of the United States government.
At a Security Council briefing on the Central African Republic, or CAR, Ambassador Robert Wood, U.S. Alternative Representative for Special Political Affairs, emphasized 3 key components necessary for the CAR government to succeed in protecting civilians and providing stability. The first is the essential role of MINUSCA, the UN Multidimensional Integrated Stabilization Mission, whose mandate for renewal is coming up in November. Ambassador Wood mourned the recent deaths and injuries of several mission peacekeepers.
Despite the difficult operating environment, MINUSCA has made contributions to peace and security over the past year in partnership with the Central African Republic government and civil society. Joint operations and enhanced mobility of mission personnel are an important means to empower the country's security forces to provide for the Central African people and support a durable and responsible restoration of state authority.
He also praised MINUSCA's role in mitigating the threat of explosive ordnance through risk reduction sessions for over 5,000 civilians and capacity building for national forces, as well as the CAR government's decision to create a national authority to address the ordnance threat. The second key component, Ambassador Wood said, is for the CAR's partners, including MINUSCA, to support local elections scheduled for October 2024. The elections, he underscored, must be conducted in a transparent, timely, and inclusive manner.
It has been far too long since Central Africans have been able to elect local leaders. We stress the importance of the full, equal, and meaningful participation of women and youth at all levels in political dialogue and throughout the elections process.
Finally, said Ambassador Wood, while it is important to combat the armed groups that refuse to participate in the peace process, the CAR government should resume dialogue with the opposition and armed groups within the framework of the peace process, and for the opposition to engage constructively. Mr. Wood also warned against the Wagner Group.
It is well documented that Kremlin-backed Wagner Group forces are engaging in illicit extraction of the CAR's mineral wealth without contributing to the country's development.
We call upon all actors to choose the path of peace, said Ambassador Wood. The Central African people deserve a political solution that will unlock the country's potential. The United States remains a steadfast partner of the Central African people.
That was an editorial reflecting the views of the United States government.
Help under horrendous war conditions.
The conflict continues to inflict unimaginable levels of suffering. Countrywide, airstrikes, artillery fire, and ground fighting continue on a daily basis.
Plus, Russian drone strikes target a Ukrainian oil refinery and leave hundreds without power.
At this point, the facility is not operating, but there is no information about victims.
And later in the program, Ukrainian volunteers are sewing adaptive clothing designed to accommodate soldiers' injuries. Today's Wednesday, November 1st. From the Voice of America, this is Flashpoint Ukraine. Good evening. I'm Lori London in Washington. Russian strikes are inflicting unimaginable suffering on the people of Ukraine, and according to the UN, more than 40% of them need humanitarian assistance.
People's lives are dominated by the constant sound of air raid sirens as unrelenting airstrikes rain down and destroy civilian objects.
Addressing the UN Security Council Tuesday, Ramesh Rajangham, Director of Coordination in the UN Humanitarian Office, said thousands of civilians have been killed in strikes on homes, schools, fields, and markets since Russia's invasion in February of 2022, and it's hitting the youngest the hardest.
The war is robbing Ukrainian children of education, the stability and safety they need during the critical development period of their lives, as well as their hopes for the future. The mental wounds of the war will undoubtedly affect children well into adulthood.
Meanwhile, the United Nations Human Rights Office also Tuesday said it had found reasonable grounds to conclude a missile strike that killed 59 people in a cafe in the Ukrainian village of Kharoza was launched by Russia. Liz Thrussell, spokesperson for the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva.
The report says that the Russian armed forces either failed to do everything feasible to verify that the target was a military objective, or deliberately targeted civilians or civilian objects, which in either event would be in violation of international humanitarian law.
Moscow denies targeting civilians. The report said the weapon likely used in the attack is in the arsenal of the Russian armed forces, but not in that of Ukraine. A Russian drone attack set fire to an oil refinery in central Ukraine and knocked out the power supply in 3 villages overnight, while falling debris from downed drones damaged railway power lines in a nearby region. I spoke with Anna Chernikova in Kyiv for an update on the ground.
Over the night, Ukraine was again under drone attack. This time, air raid alarm was heard almost over the whole territory of Ukraine, particularly in Kyiv and Kyiv region as well, which was first time in these past weeks. Kyiv was not attacked. All the targets were destroyed on the way. However, we have confirmation from the Ukrainian air defense that 2 drones hit oil refinery in Poltava region, and at this point, the facility is not operating, but there is no information about victims. In total, 20 drones were targeting Ukraine, and according to the Ukrainian air defense, all of them were targeting critical infrastructure and military facilities.
And Anna, my understanding is that Ukraine also had targets aimed at Russia again, Sevastopol region. What can you tell us about that?
Well, we don't have confirmation from Ukrainian authorities or from any other sources that Ukraine is responsible for this attack. However, again, Sevastopol was under attack, and this was confirmed by the Russian officials. This time, air raid alarm was heard in the city of Sevastopol a couple of times during the morning of Wednesday. And at this point, we have information from Russian local channels and also from the civilians who are living in Crimea right now that explosions were heard in the city of Sevastopol and smoke was seen. There is also footage confirming that the smoke over the Crimea bridge. According to Russian officials, it wasn't a drone attack and that it was air defense work. However, we do not have any confirmation from the Ukrainian side, and we cannot verify this information independently. What's important to mention here is that Sevastopol is under attack for a couple of days now, and previous attack, Russian forces reported that sea drones were targeting Sevastopol. So again, was it the same this time? we cannot confirm. However, this is definitely a story that we'll be updating.
Anna Chernikova reporting for VOA from Kyiv. Top Biden administration officials told U.S. lawmakers Tuesday that the White House request for $106 billion in emergency supplemental funding, including aid for Ukraine and Israel, is vital to U.S. national security. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin testified as the request faces significant opposition in the Republican-majority U.S. House of Representatives. VOA congressional correspondent Catherine Gibson has more.
I'm very pleased to...
U.S. officials pushing lawmakers Tuesday to move quickly to address war on two fronts, proposing $14.3 billion in U.S. aid to Israel and $61.4 billion in aid to Ukraine.
American leadership is what holds the world together. And if we fail to lead, the costs and threats to the United States will only grow.
Mike Johnson, the new Republican Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, released legislation late Monday separating aid to Ukraine from aid to Israel. That's a strategic error, according to U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken.
It would do both terrible harm to our values, but also to our core interests. Values because I think all of us are united in wanting to respond to aggressors, to bullies who try to lord it over their neighbors. And in the midst of doing that, inflict incredible suffering.
Opposition to a new round of funding for Ukraine to combat Russian aggression is broader in the House, the lower chamber of the U.S. Congress. But in the U.S. Senate, Minority Leader Mitch McConnell has been a key voice supporting continued aid to Ukraine.
Russia would love to see Iranian-backed terrorists in the Middle East weaken America and our allies. Iran would love to see a Russian victory against Ukraine that divides the West and deepens its own defense cooperation with Moscow.
Some Republican senators remain concerned, arguing there is not sufficient oversight of the aid and that the U.S. cannot indefinitely fund a war.
We need to know that we have a strategy as part of this funding. I think it's very important in terms of building support for the funding for Ukraine.
Members of the Democratic majority Senate would likely block a standalone Israel bid, arguing it must be paired with aid to the Ukraine as requested by the White House.
It doesn't meet our national security needs. And as commander-in-chief, the president's never going to do anything that doesn't meet our key national security needs.
Austin said not providing aid to Ukraine could ultimately lead to a U.S. confrontation with Russian President Vladimir Putin.
There's no question in my mind that sooner or later he will challenge NATO and we'll find ourselves in a shooting match.
The House could vote on aid to Israel as soon as this Thursday, where there is some opposition to the aid among progressive Democrats. Blinken said assistance to Palestinians would be a key part of that aid.
Humanitarian assistance is also vital to Israel's security. Providing immediate aid and protection for Palestinian civilians in this conflict is a necessary foundation for finding partners in Gaza who have a different vision for the future than Hamas.
Both the White House and Republican aid requests include $10.6 billion in support for Israel's air and missile defense systems. Catherine Gibson, VOA News.
North Korea has likely sent more than 1 million artillery shells to Russia since August to help fuel Russia's war on Ukraine. Associated Press correspondent Charles de Ledesma reports.
The claim is from a lawmaker who attended a closed-door audit meeting with South Korea's top spy agency. The North and Russia have been actively boosting the visibility of their partnership in the face of separate, deepening confrontations with the US. Their diplomacy has triggered concerns about an arms arrangement in which North Korea supplies Russia with badly needed munitions in exchange for advanced Russian technologies that would strengthen Kim Jong-un's nuclear-armed military. Both Pyongyang and Moscow have denied claims by Washington and Seoul that the North has been transferring arms to Russia. I'm Charles de Ledesma.
You're listening to VOA's Flashpoint Ukraine. I'm Lori London. Israel's ambassador to Moscow gave new details Wednesday of the weekend riot at an airport in southern Russia when a flight from Tel Aviv landed there, saying some of the passengers had to hide in the terminal before being flown to safety by helicopter. An angry mob stormed the airport carrying anti-Jewish banners as they sought out Israeli passengers. Danila Galparovich with VOA's Russian service spoke to U.S. ambassador to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, Michael Carpenter, about the anti-Semitic incident and how Russia's president is using the war in Gaza to his benefit.
This crisis is affecting OSCE countries very much. I mean, for example, what's going on in Turkey, what's going on in other countries is the consequences of this crisis. So
absolutely right. And we have discussed these consequences and we'll continue to discuss them. This latest thwarted or unrealized attack or mob-based violence in Makhachkala and Dagestan is a classic example of how what's happening in Israel is finding reverberations, in fact, in the OSCE region, not just there, but in other places too. And, we condemn that violence that occurred, and other expressions of anti-Semitism have taken place in other participating states.
We actually saw this anti-Semitic protests in Russian North Caucasus. Yes, it was not only in Makhachkala, but the Kremlin immediately blamed the United States and the West in general, as well, Ukrainian government, for, as they said, fueling these attacks and so on. So what is your reaction to these statements of Russian government?
Well, it's absolutely preposterous to claim that Ukraine or the United States would be behind an anti-Semitic mob that gathered in Dagestan. I mean, it's just... It's so preposterous, it's almost hard to comment. Really, I mean, we've gotten used to Russian lies and propaganda and spin and accusing Ukraine and the West of perpetrating the crimes that Russia is in fact perpetrating in Ukraine. This is it's truly unbelievable in the literal sense of that term.
Recently, I remember it was in the beginning of crisis in Israel and Gaza, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz reacted to some demand from Moscow to stop the violence, saying that it's the level of cynicism even I didn't expect. So what do you think how Russia is playing this crisis for its benefit?
Well, look, I mean, Russia is distorting the narrative. When it comes and speaks here at the OSCE, we have not heard the unequivocal condemnation of the terrorist attacks. We have heard sort of a narrative that tries to, as you earlier pointed out, pin the blame on other actors, especially on the West, rather than condemning what Hamas did against Israeli civilians. And we've been very clear that we support international humanitarian law, that attacks on civilians are never appropriate. We've condemned what Hamas has done in no uncertain terms. And yet Russia's narrative is very different. It's sort of one of equivocation.
Meanwhile, Russian aggression against Ukraine continues and the number of war crimes continues to increase every day. Is it possible for the OSCE to find some consensus to create a mechanism probably to investigate these crimes and to hold perpetrators accountable?
So the OSCE is engaged in this effort. Whether you consider the OSCE to have a primary role, I would say probably not. It's probably a secondary or supporting role. But we have used the Moscow mechanism, which involves the dispatch of a fact-finding mission. We have used the Office of Democratic Institutions and Human Rights to collect information on violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law to gather evidence of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and other forms of criminal conduct by Russia's forces. Now, then it is up to other international actors like the ICC or national actors like Ukraine itself or other countries that potentially have jurisdiction to prosecute those crimes. And so the OSCE is helping with that effort. There are other actors that are involved, like the UN Commission of Inquiry. In fact, there's NGOs that are involved in collecting evidence of war crimes. It's a multifaceted effort by many different actors, but ultimately all leading in the direction of trying to ensure that there is accountability and justice for the victims of these crimes.
Many experts say that Russia is counting on so-called tiredness of the West from supporting Ukraine, danger of coming winter for European economy and so on. Do you see, sitting in Vienna, anything like that the West is tired of supporting Ukraine and so on? Because there are some worrisome publications in Western media as well.
Well, I can't speak to what Russia is counting on or not counting on, but I think if they're counting on the Western coalition tiring of supporting Ukraine, I think they're counting dead wrong. I think that I've at least heard various predictions and prognostications on how the Western coalition of like-minded states supporting Ukraine would crack or would fall apart for the better part of the last year and a half, if not longer. And yet we've held strong and held together. And I think that's going to continue to be the case because ultimately, I think most governments across Europe and in North America understand, and in fact, many around the world, to include some of our partners in East Asia, understand that this is about the fundamental principles of the integrity of the territorial integrity of states. It's about protecting human rights. It's about protecting populations from torture and other egregious abuses of human rights. And it's the principle, on the one hand, it's either the principle of might makes right, which is not a principle we want to uphold, or it's a principle of the UN Charter and the Helsinki Final Act, or the principles, I should say, that are encoded in those documents. And so I think that we're going to continue to hang together because it's so important that Russia not succeed in Ukraine and that Ukraine actually, in fact, win this war. It's not going to be easy. It's going to take a lot of determination. It's going to take a lot of resources, financial, military, and otherwise. But I have no doubt that the Western coalition of countries that is supporting Ukraine will continue that support for as long as it takes. And that's a term that we've used, but I truly believe that we will continue to support Ukraine until it prevails. My final thought would be that what we're seeing now around the world with the eruption of violence, including the violence from Hamas, the violence that's perpetrated by the Russian Federation, I mean, this all goes to the type of world that we're going to be living in, our children and grandkids are going to be living in the future. And so when we speak about abstract principles like the international rules-based order, those are not principles that get people's hearts racing or that get people excited about standing up for what's right. But behind those somewhat sterile words are the fate of human lives, of people, of men, women, children who often find themselves in harm's way and sometimes are subjected to really brutal types of behaviors, whether it's coming from Russian forces in Ukraine or whether it's Hamas and what Hamas has done with Israeli civilians. And so sometimes it's important to sort of step back from the international diplo-speak and think about what this means for concrete human beings and standing up for what's right. And I think in that regard, we need to sustain this international coalition to stand up for what's right, whether it's in the Middle East, whether it's for Ukraine's victory against Russia, or in any other part of the world. Standing up for fundamental human dignity is important.
U.S. Ambassador to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, Michael Carpenter, speaking with VOA Russian Services' Danila Galperovich. A Russian court on Tuesday ordered a Russian-American journalist to remain in jail ahead of trial on charges of failing to register as a foreign agent rather than be released to house arrest. Alsu Kormasheva is the second U.S. journalist detained in Russia this year after Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich was arrested on espionage charges in March. Gershkovich remains in custody. At the Military and Editors Association conference in Washington last week, Ukraine's ambassador to the United States, Oksana Markarova, noted the vital role of journalists and the dangers they're facing to get the story out.
This experience that we have for the past 610 days, it's frankly something that we never had before, only read about it during the World War II. During these 600 days, we were just going through the list with our people back home, and my defense attaché, Major General Kremenetsky, is here with me. We have seen that we have already lost during this war 70 journalists, reporters, and staffers. 70. That's unbelievable loss of not only talent, but something that shouldn't be happening even during the wars. But the rules that Russians do not obey are not only rules of engagement, not only the humanitarian laws and rules, but even with journalists. So a friend of mine, who when we found him in near Irpin, Max Levin, he still had his press vest on him. So they knew who they were killing. And I just want to start by thanking all of you, and by thanking you and those who are now in Ukraine and who are now in Israel and who are now in so many places covering the war, because it's very important. Without you, the world would not know what really happens, and it would be so easy for propaganda or for fakes or for aggressors to actually spread, instead of truth, spread the false narratives about it. And that's part of the war.
Also, Kurmasheva, an editor for the U.S. government-funded Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, was taken into custody on October 18th. Since the beginning of the war, Ukrainian volunteers have been sewing adaptive clothes designed to accommodate soldiers' injuries. The Ukrainian government does not release official casualty statistics for the military, but volunteers say they have constant demand for such clothing. Lizha Bakalets has the story from Kyiv.
For more than a year, volunteer Olga Skidinets has been turning ordinary T-shirts into adaptive ones, shirts specifically made to account for soldiers' injuries. Before the war, sewing was her hobby. Now it is a way to help the war effort. Skidinets demonstrates how the adaptive T-shirt works. She says it has Velcro on the sides, so it can easily open. She says you can put the T-shirt under the wounded soldier, make a bandage, and then fasten it. Before Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the clothes were most often worn by patients who were bedridden or had mobility issues. But now demand has increased among wounded soldiers. Skidinets says that when soldiers have severe injuries to their limbs, they need to be fixed externally using different metal constructions. The apparatus are huge, and it is impossible to fit a leg or arm into ordinary clothes. The main requirement for adaptive clothes is soft and natural fabric. Closures like Velcro, for example, shouldn't rub. Skidinets says she cuts the corners of the Velcro and burns the edges so it becomes softer and does not rub on an injured soldier. Designer Rostislav Satana created a set of adaptive clothing after a soldier came to him with the idea. He says the set includes an adaptive T-shirt and pants. In summer, he and his partners also started making adaptive shirts and tank tops. The set's design is based on soldiers' feedback. For instance, he says some soldiers are bedridden and their belongings fall out of ordinary pockets, so he created different ones. The wounded soldiers also need adaptive underwear made by this group of women from the Kyiv region. Volunteer Galina Grishenko says the underpants have Velcro on the sides and that only volunteers produce them. And the new underwear is not just about hygiene. Grishenko says that underwear is about dignity and the soldiers should feel confident and protected. Recently, volunteers have been using funny fabrics. The soldiers like it. Grishenko says volunteers ask the soldiers, who needs adaptive underpants today? We have space, watermelons, machines. She says it cheers the soldiers up. All adaptive clothes are free to soldiers. Volunteers gather donations to pay for materials. They say sewing helps them to cope with the stress, but all dream about the day when adaptive clothes will not be in high demand. Lizha Bakalets, VOA News, Kyiv.
And that'll do it for us today. Stay up to date with continuing coverage of Ukraine and news from around the world, 24 hours a day at voanews.com. And on social media, just follow VOA News. On behalf of all of us here at VOA, we thank you so much for listening. Until next time, I'm VOA